Since my very youngest days, I was treated as a golden child. My mother heaped buttloads of affection onto me and bragged to her friends how great of a son I was. I fear my younger brother missed out because she had already spent all of the love she had on me, so to speak. I joke about this, but I am somewhat serious at the same time. His upbringing lacked much of the praise and attention I was given. When I began playing in organized sports, the rest of the world joined in. Soccer came first. It all came so naturally, and before long, I was the top-scoring member of the team. Once I discovered football, everything else went by the wayside. Posters of Brady and Bledsoe covered my walls. My large, strong hands allowed me to grip and throw the ball with the power and precision not many twice my age had. All 3 years of middle school, I remained the starting quarterback. I did so well that by high school, I was playing on par with most seniors. My prowess in sports, of course, made me very popular in school. One of my teachers called me the big man on campus. I was never lacking the attention and approval of the staff and most of my fellow students. I didn't get a free ride, though. Without good grades, I wasn't qualified to play. Luckily for me, I had always been good at most subjects, except for perhaps math, in which I scored lower Bs. I had decided by my second year which college I would attend. I knew if I continued on my current path, I'd be quarterbacking for a professional team right out of college. To encompass all I had achieved, I quote a line I had once read that described a man as having the world in the palm of his hand. That's probably the best way I could describe the trajectory I had put upon myself. I was destined for success, and nothing was going to get in my way. I tell you all this in order to show just how far I was soon to fall, and exactly how much I was about to lose. I was a junior. I had already been named the starter on the varsity team. When not studying, I split my time between the weight room and practice. It was just before the third game of the season when Rosalind arrived. I had my mind off somewhere else when she entered our class. I still remember it like it was yesterday. A few of my classmates were grumbling about something, and it caught my attention. I happened to look up just as she was passing near me, and her beauty was breathtaking. I can honestly say with confidence you've never seen her equal in Hollywood. The rich silkiness of her auburn hair, to the sensual fullness of her lips and her porcelain skin, not an inch of her image had a flaw. I gave her my heart in that moment, and I knew nothing would equal her in my life. She took her seat at the back of the class. None of the shyness that usually existed in the newly arrived students showed in her actions. The room was hers completely now, and she knew it. My focus was on her for the remainder of the period. She had to have known. My gaze would have burned right through her had my eyes been lasers. This day marked the beginning of a long downhill slide, and I would give anything to experience every second of that time again. Concentrating on anything else was impossible. Class after class, only Rosalind existed. Practice was much the same. I wasn't on a football field. I was still in that class, soaking in every inch, every curve of her body. From then on, my only thoughts were about her. I used my charm to get her address from an office worker. That Friday evening, as I led the team to another victory, my only desire was for the game to end. Afterwards, I sat outside her house dreaming about her and I, walking hand in hand through the halls as everyone watched jealously. I resolved in that moment that I would own her body and soul until the end of my life. My first action upon arriving at school that following Monday was to locate Rosalind and bare my heart to her. I did just that, but her reaction wasn't what I'd envisioned. I spoke from my heart. Every word was true, but rather than collapse into my arms as I'd seen on TV so many times, she replied with 4 short words. I don't think so. I will admit to being disappointed, but her response left me with a ray of hope. She hadn't been cruel or mocking after all. Perhaps she had been playing hard to get. I knew I had to pursue her as a hunter pursues his prey. Maybe I would even be required to make a large sacrifice to prove my love. After all, that's the way it works in the great Hollywood films and novels. She would realize she belonged with me. I just needed to help her realize that. I searched my soul, day and night, for a way to make this happen. Suddenly it hit from out of the blue. If I gave up football, she would have to see how dedicated I was to her. That day I informed the coach of my decision. It went about as well as you would think. He was angry and yelled for almost an hour, but at the end of our meeting, he wished me well. I was elated. I had to tell Rosalind that very second. She didn't answer my text right away, but when she did, her only answer was, "Why?" The queasiness churned up in my stomach. Even after all I'd done to let her know I loved her, putting it into words still made me very nervous. "I did it for you," I said. My hands shook as they moved to push send. It was now or never. She would be left with no doubt to how I felt about her. After sending it, the time seemed to drag on forever. The hours passed with no word from her, and I couldn't take it any longer. I sped over to her house and waited outside her window. I watched as she changed for bed. Every curve, every line of her body remains with me to this day. I sent a new text to let her know that I was waiting. She appeared at her window within seconds. Seeing her in the nightgown made my heart race, and there was only one reason she would let me see her this way. My mouth was dry with anticipation. I broke into a sweat. I expected to be met with soft words, but instead she began yelling, almost screaming. Her words didn't make sense. I was confused by her behavior. It only got worse when her father came outside. I tried to explain my love for his beautiful daughter, but he was deaf to my words. Rosalind began to curse me from her window, terrible things I don't dare repeat here. I never dreamed this could have happened. With every word, her curses knocked me lower and lower. It was a pain I'd not wish on anyone. I was so distraught I didn't hear the word police until it was almost too late. I fled just as I noticed flashing lights up the street. I laid down in my car as they passed and sped away as they pulled up to Rosalind's house. My sobs grew and grew until I was consumed by my grief. I laid curled up upon my bed, wailing uncontrollably. However, as my tears began to subside, another fire kindled inside. My anger roared by the second, until it consumed any sadness I once had. And by dawn, I transformed into some sort of beast. A monster I never knew existed in me had taken control of my body. I began to rage. I thought, no one says those things to someone who loves them. They know the power they have over them. The idea of punishment fleeted in and out of my brain, briefly at first, then more and more until it set root and fostered a plan for retribution. I see now just how far I had gone. My love, if that's what you can call it, had transformed from obsession into hate. The quickness in which this occurred still terrifies me. In that day and in that time, I could only think of one thing: revenge. She had to feel my pain. There was no other way she could learn what she had done. I entered the school that morning with a single, focused purpose. My anger had clouded my mind from considering the consequences of what I was about to do. I could see the terror in her eyes as I drew closer, and I could remember feeling satisfied by this. I said nothing. I just grabbed her by the throat, both hands gripping as tightly as possible, and I knew it wouldn't take long. My grip was strong and my hands were large. I was oblivious to the grabbing and pulling of others around me. Her face took on a dark red, then almost purple hue, and I knew it wouldn't be long now. I stared into her beautiful green eyes that I had dreamt of for countless hours, and was awed by them even as they filled with the streaking of blood. My adoration angered me even more. The next thing I remember was lying on the school floor being held down. The din of their yells seemed muffled. I was miles away, lost in the confusing pattern of the ceiling tiles above me. I'm not sure how long it was before I was told Rosalind had survived. It appeared I had been stopped before I was able to achieve my goal. This news didn't anger me, nor was I relieved. I had become numb. It's taken me many months to reclaim the identity I once was. I was terrified to feel anything. I'd become nothing more than a frightened child. I've been fortunate enough to be sent to an institution that focuses on therapeutic rehabilitation. I'm by no means fully healed, for the lack of a better word. there still are moments where I find myself giving over to my dark side. I don't necessarily blame the entertainment industry for the way they portray relationships or the pursuit of love in a wider context. I'm responsible for the way I handle the situation. Something inside of me is broken. However, in the same breath, I do question what impression they intend on presenting. A young, naive, and romantic man such as myself is inundated with talk of the so-called game and the premise of sacrificing for love, among other trite concepts. Without any real guidance from a more experienced adult or father figure, a young male often uses images from the popular entertainment around him. It is a discussion that should be had considering more boys are growing up without a positive male role model in their lives. Please pardon me for going off onto my own path. I still require a lot of work. The purpose of writing this was to recount the events that led me to my current position. My counselor and I agreed that it would be a good idea to put my story and my feelings at the time on paper. It could serve as a motivating factor for myself and others to see how far I've come in my therapy. Now that I have, it is certainly encouraging to see the progress I've made. At the same time, it's shed light upon the darker side of my personality, and that has been a horrifying vision. Despite this, I'm confident I'm on the path to regaining my true self, and perhaps one day you'll recognize the brother you grew up with. I've just about written down everything I can recall from that time, and lights out is quickly approaching. I'll make a copy of this for my counselor, minus a little epilogue to you. Of course, I'll be sending you this version for yourself. Feel free to share it with your mom or anybody else in the family that may be curious. I've written Mom a short note just about regular stuff and sent it last week, so she should receive that soon. If you have the time, I'd like you to do something like we discussed and seek out the proper place on the internet to share this. All I ask is that you leave out my name, but I probably don't have to tell you that. I'm sure you don't normally tell people your older brother is psycho. I'd like young people to be able to read an authentic account of what goes on in the mind of someone like me without all the sensationalistic fluff. I don't seek notoriety or fame for what I've done. It is an inexcusable act against one I profess to love. My hope is that it can serve as a template for the young, a diagnostic instrument to help them recognize the same patterns in their friends or themselves and stop them before they get out of control. I'd like to think if more people had access to this type of information, things like stalking and the crimes that go with it may be able to be stopped completely, or at the least greatly reduced. I'll continue to do all I can to stem the tide from here. Perhaps, if enough on the outside can see this, we can create a better world for everyone. From my experience, most everybody had that creepy dude they knew from school or hung out with. In my school, we all called him Jay, and he was perhaps the creepiest of the creepy. I had the unenviable honor of being there on his first day. It was kindergarten, and a lot of the kids threw a fit when they were separated from their parents. I don't hold that against them. We were only 5 after all. Rather than accepting the separation and joining the others in class, he made things even worse. His mom hadn't been gone 10 minutes, and he soiled himself. This wasn't a reaction to stress, like you may expect. It turned to be out of pure spite. He must have used this before to control people. When the teacher called his mother, she returned in a matter of minutes and took him home. He had such a smug look on his face as he left, and I knew even then as a little kid that things weren't getting better. The following day, his mother dropped him off in class and he repeated the disgusting behavior, and, of course, his mother was called again to pick him up. This vicious power play continued for a week. His mom would leave. He'd bawl his head off for 5 minutes straight, only to soil himself again. You probably get it by now. That Friday morning would be the last time I'd see Jay for almost 10 years. We moved forward to the first day of sophomore year. We were all sitting in our chairs and the teacher calls out everyone's names. When she called out Jay's, I almost soiled myself. I looked around frantically until this short, overweight kid raised his hand. He was almost a carbon copy of the little kid I remembered. Except now, he looked even worse. His hair was long and greasy, his face covered by patches of hair, and he was wearing this old gray jacket with stains all over it. I think it may have been a members-only one. This was 2013. I was unable to grasp why he looked so bad. As far as I was aware, his family wasn't poor. In fact, I believe his dad was a dentist with his own practice. My amazement toward him would only grow. As class was let out and he passed by me, a cloud of stink almost knocked me down. Man, did he smell. Similar to wet garbage. I probably should have expected it considering his appearance, but this level of funk was all new to me. I did my best to keep my head down and slip out unnoticed. As far as I could tell, he didn't remember me, and boy was I relieved. Little did I know his hygiene would become the least of his cons. A month passed and school was as lame as ever. Jay remained offensive to the nose and eyes. His gray jacket had become dirtier than his hair. I think he even had Dorito crumbs falling off of it one morning. Unfortunately, his behavior would be far nastier. I caught wind of a story going around that some kid was showing other male students lewd photos of his sister. When I discovered it was Jay, I can't say I was shocked. Disgusted, but not shocked. Eventually, my time came. He approached me in my locker and shoved his phone in my face. Once I was able to focus on the screen, I realized it was indeed a photo of a girl who looked disturbingly similar to himself. I can't say I recall the quality of the picture. His stench was just too distracting. Even though I was in a constant state of discomfort, I was taken aback at how proud he was of the picture. His smile stretched from ear to ear. It was like he was showing me a hot rod he'd built with his dad. And perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the encounter was when I learned that the girl was only 13. I couldn't imagine how strange his relationship with his sister must have been. No matter how gruesome things connected to this dude were, he always managed to outdo himself. I guess the shots were so popular, he took things up a level and began selling the videos of her showering. Although I was lucky enough not to see those atrocities, I was told by folks who did that rather than being some creep videos, the subject was well aware that she was being filmed. I can't say she was aware her brother was selling them, though. Of course, Jay's dirty little secret wouldn't stay that way for long. It wasn't more than a week after he launched his filmic endeavor before it was shut down. The principal and others in power at the school got word of his actions, and he was brought in for questioning. Once they had a full grip on what had been going on right under their noses, law enforcement was informed, thankfully. The rest came to me by word of mouth, so take it with a pinch of salt. According to some people, things between Jay and his sister were even more shocking than we believed. She would admit that her and Jay had been involved in some form of physical relationship for the last 3 years. In addition to that, he wasn't just selling videos around school. He'd been peddling far more explicit clips on the dark web, believe it or not, at least what I was hearing. The rumor mill was churning in overdrive. Jay's sudden disappearance led to all kinds of theories and suppositions. What I do know is that he was gone almost as quickly as he had arrived, and not many missed him. The same source I had gotten my information from prior claimed he had done a few months in a juvenile facility and was released. Basically a slap on the wrist. However, at the time, there was still the question of how hard the feds were going to go after him. Unfortunately, life moved on, and I guess folks forgot about Jay. And I can't tell you his ultimate fate. Despite him being a disgusting mess of a person, I feel bad for the others who suffered because of him. The strain revolving around the situation caused his parents to divorce, but perhaps the person who suffered the most was his younger sister. Not only had her public life been ruined, she was forced to drop out of school soon after it all came out. The abuse she had suffered at the hands of Jay has to have done some major long-term damage. I pray she's been able to make something of her life. As for Jay, I could care less how he is. Creatures like him never change. They destroy lives of all those around them, and the world will be a much better place without him. I attended most of my schooling in a small town in southern Oklahoma. In a place with such a small population, you get to know everybody pretty fast. When you're a kid, this can be a big headache. You can't make a single mistake without everyone around knowing about it, including your folks. To this day, I can still tell you the name of the girl that ate paste in kindergarten and the boy who peed his pants in 3rd grade. It's not a way I'd like my kids to grow up. Nonetheless, even in a place so small, there was one kid who managed to live a second, invisible life right under the noses of the nosiest of citizens. For the sake of the story, I'll call him Elliot. He was the last person you'd expect of having a secret life. His family had run the largest business in the county for 100 years. If I recall correctly, he even had 2 uncles who had served in the state legislature. He had been raised to be a successful person, and on the surface, nothing about him gave you the impression that he was anything else. All the teachers loved him. His grades were always better than everyone else's, and he never hesitated to make himself the center of attention. Even with every eye in the area on him, he had one habit no one had any clue about. Elliot liked to watch. This clean-cut, unassuming young man was a peeper, a peeping Tom, a voyeur, if you will. Of course, nobody knew this, or admitted to it at least. This would all change on the night of homecoming. Our classmates were all kitted up in their finest, each waiting their turn to get their pictures taken so they could head to their real destination, a local hotel where loads of cheap booze awaited them. Normally, Elliot would be one of the few actually attending the dance with his girlfriend. Instead, while the rest of the town had their minds on the celebration, he was creeping through his quiet neighborhood in search of something to see. Just before 11, he came upon the open window of a 10-year-old girl. He later told the police that, on a prior expedition, he had noticed the girl's open curtains. Upon getting closer, he watched as she removed her clothes for bed, and despite knowing it was wrong, he realized for the first time that he was attracted to very young girls. He claimed he was disgusted by this and cut his nighttime journey short. As time passed, however, the urge to return overtook him. Because of all the people on the streets that night, he wasn't able to return early enough to relive the previous adventure in his mind. When he arrived and saw the open window, a little voice told him to go inside. The house is dark. Everyone's already in bed, so no one would see you. Besides, you just want to watch her sleep, that's all. Unfortunately, Elliot listened to this voice. Entering as silently as possible, he walked across the room toward the corner. He was just inches away when he stepped on a squeaky dog toy, apparently. The high-pitched noise echoed through the room. He froze and prayed the girl wouldn't be awakened. God was not with him that night at all. She shot up in bed as if she had been awaiting such a moment, and things just got worse from there. She turned on her bedside light, and Elliot was fully illuminated. The terrified girl began screaming, and Elliot knew he only had a few seconds to flee. He turned and ran for the window, and he was mere feet away from where a strong hand grabbed him by the collar and yanked him back in. He'd barely hit the floor before a hail of powerful kicks and punches rained down upon him. The most he could do was curl up and take the abuse. A moment later, the violence stopped and he peeked out from his arm, and looking down on him was who he had assumed to be the girl's father. The man's face terrified him. He'd never seen such anger until then. The police arrived quickly, and within minutes, they had Elliot in cuffs. It wasn't long before the whole town knew. Although he hadn't done more than trespass into a house at night, the district attorney tried to charge him with every crime possible. Even with all the money and influence of his family behind him, there was no way he was getting off scot-free. He had foolishly spoken to the cops. They had his words to use against him. His lawyer was able to get the DA to drop most of the charges in exchange for a plea. Ultimately, he served 13 months in jail with an additional 5 years probation tacked on. The length of the sentence meant nothing. His life in town was over. After he was released, he became a prisoner in his own home. He didn't dare leave. A day didn't go by without some death threat or other harassment on his phone. To the relief of everybody, the day his probation ended, he quietly slipped out of town in the middle of the night, never to be seen again. Everybody in school knew Natasha was different. I suppose different is being kind. When you live in a town where everyone around you acts and looks very much the same, a girl like her would, of course, stand out. I'd have to describe her as a goth girl, if that term is even still used. Her skin had a naturally pale tone, but she did all she could to make sure it never got any darker. The Victorian parasol she carried everywhere with her blocked out any possible ray of sun from touching her porcelain-like skin. As if her skin and 100-year-old umbrella didn't make her stand out, her choice of clothing just made her appear stranger to most. I don't think Naughty, as we called her, owned any color but black. From her coal-black hair all the way down to the tips of her patent leather boots, only the chalkiness of her skin offered any contrast. If you were to guess that she was quiet and reserved, you wouldn't be far off. When she did speak, it was only in reaction to another's rude remarks. Even then, she was a girl of few words. She had a cutting type of wit. It didn't take her long to put folks in their place. Most people never got to see her other side. This version of Naughty was terrifying and most likely the cause of her future ghoulish behavior. Before I get to the meat and potatoes of my story, I want to warn my readers. If you are triggered or get excessively upset about the subject of animals getting hurt, stop here. Although I will try to be as family-friendly in my descriptions as possible, some things just have to be said. You've been warned. With that out of the way, I'll finally get to the heart of the matter. Despite knowing not everyone who looks and dresses like Naughty are capable of doing the things she did, I think that look was a reflection of how she felt inside. I could never excuse her behavior, but coming from someone who knew her rather intimately, she had to have struggled with that evil inside of her. The Naughty I knew was an intelligent and sensitive person. Nonetheless, she harbored a deep-seated anger that drove her to commit a string of unforgivable acts. I never learned exactly what caused it, but I suspect it stemmed from some form of abuse she suffered. I foolishly asked about her grandfather on one occasion. This regular, everyday question caused a 30-minute tirade. Safe to say, he wasn't a good person. This is likely what led to her compulsion to have power over another living thing. I was already off at school for my first year of college. Naughty, who was a year younger than me, was a senior. We were still on speaking terms after our separation, but I'd not heard from her for a few months. When I had a spare moment, I called to catch up. Her mother answered her phone instead. This naturally surprised me. My surprise soon turned to concern when I was told that Naughty wasn't around anymore. I was shocked and asked what had happened, expecting her to say that she passed. Mrs. Ellis coldly stated that Naughty had not died, but she wouldn't be free to speak to me ever again. Then she quickly said goodbye and hung up. I was confused and hungry for answers, so I called a friend who had stayed behind to work. The story I heard still chills me to this day. My friend's dad was a retired cop and still had a lot of contacts inside the department. I knew he'd probably know what happened. A lot of the details concerning her punishment were hazy, but the gruesomeness of her crimes were not. The story goes something like this. Not long after her and I separated, people's cats began to disappear. The ones that were eventually found, the bodies had been drained of their blood and ripped to pieces. Initially, the deaths were attributed to a coyote or dog attacks. With no blood found at the scene, this theory didn't hold up. A few of the wackier folks around town even claimed the deaths were the work of the chupacabra. A total of 22 pets would be lost to the cat slasher in all. Owners who had once let their cats out began keeping their pets in, and neighbors watched their fellow citizens with distaste and distrust. Then, late one evening, the true culprit was caught in the act. A man was out walking his dog when he took notice of a car driving slowly up and down the street. It had passed him several times, but he assumed the driver was searching for a particular address. This changed when he turned onto a new street and witnessed the driver get out and attempt to catch a cat. When the driver realized they'd been seen, they returned to the car and sped away. It was too late, though. The man copied down the license plate number and turned it into the police. The crime that hadn't had much attention from the police until then, drew much more of their interest when the car's owner was discovered. Natasha was no stranger to the police. She'd had multiple complaints filed against her in the past. Most were actually just baseless accusations from older people who distrusted her simply because she looked different. She's a devil worshiper and other equally stupid fantasies. However, she'd also been caught shoplifting once or twice. Fortunately for her, she had some mysterious family connection that made everything go away. Things wouldn't be any different this time. Despite admitting everything to the cops that interviewed her, often in gory detail, she would be let off with no repercussions. In fact, the press didn't even mention a suspect had been arrested. Despite knowing her name and all that was said, it was almost as if none of it had even happened. The disappearances just stopped, and almost nobody even knew why. At first, I was in complete shock, but as time passed, it began to make sense. Naughty had always hated cats. I never discovered why, but something major had to have occurred to cause her behavior. And before anyone asked if she took this dark turn because of our breakup, just forget it. She was more than happy to be free again. In fact, I may have been the only thing keeping her from going down that path sooner. For all I know, it had already started prior to our separation and nobody had noticed. I'm guilt-free, my friend. During my visits back home, the subject was brought up a few times. One guy even said he had heard she had been drinking the blood of the cats. She wasn't beyond doing something so crazy, but the girl I knew would have thought something so ceremonial was stupid. Through the grapevine, I did eventually discover where she had gone. Mere days after her release, she was shipped off to a mental health facility out west. What happened to her after that, I have no clue. Despite the terrible and cruel things she did, I still catch myself hoping she'll call from time to time. Mostly, I just want to hear her explanation. Whether I do or not, I hope she gets the help she needs. I'd hate to know more people's pets could be in danger because she couldn't resolve the problems from her past. If she does contact me, I'll post an update. Watch this line and stay tuned. I'm just as morbidly curious as you. I used to work at a Starbucks here in Cardiff, and I've got to be honest, it's one of the better jobs I've ever had. The manager was brilliant, the other staff were nice and looked out for each other, so for a minimum-ish wage job, it was about as good as it gets. The only bad shifts to work were the first halves of Monday and Tuesday mornings, as the pre-work rush meant people were often at their absolute worst. I mean, don't get me wrong, people could be complete jerks at other times of the day or week, but the highest concentration of them was Monday and Tuesday mornings, without a shadow of a doubt. But rude customers aren't scary. Annoying and frustrating, yes. Chillingly cruel and calculating, not as much. Which is why this particular incident has stayed with me for so long, and I always seem to use it as my personal point of reference for how terrible human beings can be to each other. So, it's a Monday morning, and we're just coming to the end of the rush at around 9 a.m. 30 minutes more and the caffeine fiends will start to thin out and we can get some coffee and make a smoke break of our own. I heard her before I saw her. Like she was only just trying to get a handle on what had been pure harpy screeches just moments before. Some woman was on her phone, ranting away and not looking where she was going as she tries to find the back of the queue. In doing so, she cuts off this other bloke who politely informs her that she's queue jumping. I don't know if she actually didn't hear him or was just tactically ignoring him, but either way, this bloke has to tap her on the shoulder before saying, "Excuse me, believe I was ahead of you." The woman just shrugs this off at first, giving the guy a gesture like, "I'm too busy to listen to you." I remember the look of anger on the guy's face as she gently but firmly grabs the strap of her handbag and tugs her out of the queue before taking her place. I'm a bit torn about the whole thing. Like, yeah, it was righteous, but laying hands on someone, I feel like there could have been a better way to resolve the issue. But it wasn't like the guy had picked her up and thrown her, and due to the size difference, that was definitely a possibility. Anyway, she reacts like this had been the case, like him actually standing up to her with some horrific incident of assault and starts demanding someone call the police, even though she herself was on the phone and simply refused to hang up. A couple of staff members and customers managed to calm the situation down, and we get the guy his coffee before one of my colleagues serves the angry woman. I didn't serve her, but when she got her order, she turns to be like, excuse me, this coffee isn't as hot as I asked for. No, I know better than to just argue with customers and especially absolute whoppers like her, so I do as I'm asked and heat the coffee up a little bit more for her. I hand it back. She dips a finger in it and once again tells me, this coffee isn't hot enough. Now bearing in mind, she just watched me run some steam through it, but again, I do as I'm asked and give her back some literally steaming hot coffee that she proceeds to absolutely overload with sugar. No wonder she was in such a stinking mood. Her entire life was probably one big sugar crash, hence why she was such an unbearable person to be around. But little did I realize, that coffee wasn't for her, and on her way out of the store, she took the lid off of her scalding hot syrupy coffee and threw it in the guy's face as he sat reading his newspaper. God, the sound of that guy screaming was absolutely horrific. Like I didn't actually see the woman throw her coffee in the guy's face, so I thought someone had broken a leg or something. That's the only time I've heard someone scream in pain like that. When my old skating buddy absolutely shattered his leg on this visit to a Bristol skate park one year. But what followed in the coffee shop was pure chaos. People were pouring bottles of water onto this guy's face, ambulance staff and police turning up. I think the woman legged it as soon as she threw the coffee because, to my knowledge, no one was arrested, but the guy who had the coffee thrown on him suffered life-changing injuries. From what another colleague told me, the gross amount of sugar in the coffee meant that some of it actually stuck to his face like a kind of molten hot glue. He'd been left with terrible scarring for the rest of his life, and all because he stood up to some absolute monster in the queue that morning. That's what I find really scary, that some people out there are so unhinged that a seemingly normal interaction with them could end up with you suffering injuries you'll carry with you for the rest of your life. Just one moment of misjudgment, one little enough is enough moment, and boom, you're going to look at a very different version of yourself in the mirror for the rest of your natural life. For the past few years or so, I've lived here in Redwood City, California. Back in 2008, some of you might remember that a Philadelphia branch of Starbucks asked two African Americans to leave because they hadn't bought anything. They were accused of racism, there was a whole bunch of fallout from it, and in the end, Starbucks announced that it would no longer ask anyone to leave their stores as long as they weren't causing a disturbance. From what I heard, this prompted a bunch of trouble with homeless people hanging around Starbucks outlets and generally making a nuisance of themselves, but I can't really speak to that because the only homeless guy that ever showed up in my local Starbucks was Steve. Steve was about as far from the stereotypical idea of a homeless person as you can imagine. I remember seeing him in relatively clean clothes, tapping away on a smartphone that was charging from a nearby power outlet and not giving him a second glance. I walked in, got my coffee, and carried on my way to work. The next morning, Steve is there again, paper in front of him, tapping away on his smartphone. Only this time, as I'm in line waiting to give my order, I see him reaching for a grubby-looking backpack that seemed to contain all of his worldly possessions. It dawned on me that he didn't have a coffee in front of him, and when I thought about it, he didn't have one that day before either. And that's when I realized that Steve was in fact homeless. And it was then that I actually noticed how tired he looked, how the skin of his face was stretched around his eye sockets like he'd skipped one too many meals in his time. Steve was obviously taking advantage of Starbucks' new policy in order to get indoors and charge his phone, and although he was technically taking up the space of a paying customer, none who got an inkling of his living situation ever seemed to complain. This was until one day when Steve got himself into some kind of confrontation with a customer. I think maybe one of his bag straps was lying in the way of someone because I only looked up in time after hearing someone apologize. This big guy in a bad suit scoffed as he sat down close by, shaking his head. "Shouldn't even be here," the big guy said. I thought it was quite an obnoxious comment, but I'm far too much of an introvert to say anything about it. Steve tried to apologize again, but the guy started going off on him, telling him he shouldn't be there if he wasn't a paying customer. And in a display of kindness that'll stay with me for the rest of my life, the guy at the head of the line bought Steve a coffee and a red berry cheese Danish. There, now he has something, so mind your business. It wasn't one of those, and then everyone clapped, moments. It was still incredibly awkward since no one wanted to get into a shouting match at that time in the morning, especially not me. So after the fat guy was shamed into silence, he just sort of wrapped his double-smoked bacon and walked out, avoiding eye contact as he went. That's when I found out his name was Steve, and every morning after, if Steve was in the Starbucks, I'd always say hi and asked if he wanted a coffee or a red berry cheese. Some mornings he'd accept, some he'd decline, and I came to learn that he used the charger and the free Wi-Fi to look for a job. He wasn't a drug addict, he wasn't an alcoholic, he'd just fallen on hard times after a nervous breakdown and was slowly building himself back up and putting his life back together. Learning that is how me and a handful of other Starbucks regulars developed a great deal of affection for Steve after a while, but our regular cheery encounters with him somehow made it easier to forget that he slept under Redwood Junction every night, and I guess assuring ourselves that Steve would be okay meant we could just walk away and not worry about it. Because one Monday morning when I walked into the Starbucks and saw Steve's seat empty, I automatically assumed it was good news. Maybe he'd found a place to stay, or maybe he'd struck gold in his job search, and I found myself asking the barista if they'd heard anything from Steve over the weekend. To my absolute delight, he told me Steve had an interview at a local car wash. He wasn't sure exactly what day, he just knew that Steve had made the announcement the previous afternoon before departing the store. So, that was the end of seeing Steve on my morning Starbucks runs. I hoped that he might show up again, buying his own coffee, looking healthier and happier, but he didn't, and I guess that was just fine. But at the same time, I'd have been lying if I said I didn't kind of miss him. Like I might have mentioned, I'm a card-carrying introvert, but I do enjoy a sense of community. I still enjoy the comfort of familiar faces, so anyone who makes me comfortable enough to come out of my shell, I appreciate that more than I think I can even describe. So after a few weeks of not seeing Steve at all, I decided to take a walk down to some of the local car washes to see if I could spot Steve. First place I asked hadn't heard of him, neither had the second place. But the third car wash I tried said that they were hoping I was the one who could give them answers. You see, the third place I tried was indeed the same place Steve had an interview scheduled, but it was an interview he hadn't shown up for. I asked if he'd called ahead to cancel or anything, and the car wash boss said no, and that he just ghosted. And that's when I really started to worry. My concern for Steve's well-being grew to the point where I began to entertain the idea of going down to the Redwood Junction to look for him. I hope I don't sound too prejudiced when I say I found it an intimidating prospect. Like, as much as I appreciate that a lot of homeless people are just like Steve, good people who've fallen on hard times, I know that there are some people in the streets who are so broken that they do actually pose a danger to the general public. But as I said, my concern grew and grew until I didn't give good care if the sight of homeless people camp would upset my delicate sensibilities. A man's life was at stake. I needed to act. I wasn't sure I'd be able to live with myself otherwise. That was how I ended up cycling down to the junction one Saturday afternoon, where I began nervously giving descriptions of Steve and asking if people had seen him. People mostly shook their heads at me, looking at me like I'd grown an extra nose or something. I guess having visitors to the camp wasn't exactly a common occurrence. Time and time again, I was met with the same response. A shrug, a shake of the head, complete indifference. At least until I spoke to one much older guy who wore a Vietnam veteran baseball cap and a grimy old fatigue jacket. This guy seemed a little bit more with it than some of the other homeless folks, and although he had a distinct smell of marijuana about him, He was lucid enough to get a straight answer from. After confirming we were talking about the same Steve, this vet told me that he knew him well, but that he hadn't been around the junction in a few days. When I pressed him for where Steve might have gone, the vet shrugged, but told me Steve had left behind a bunch of his belongings. According to him, this could be a good thing just as much as a bad thing. When some homeless folks find a way off the street, either moving back in with family or getting a place in a program somewhere, they leave behind all their stuff. Some just don't need it anymore. A tent and a sleeping bag are useless when you have a room and a bed, but others find that the stuff they had on the street just reminds them of a time they'd rather just forget about. But sometimes, leaving all their stuff behind meant something bad had happened. I could see the worry just etched into the vet's face, and he seemed to be racking his brain for a moment before an idea struck him. He mentioned that Steve used to bring food to a girl who stayed on the other side of the camp, and that maybe she'd know where he was. Up until talking to that girl, my time at the camp had been unexpectedly uplifting. Sure, seeing people living like that was upsetting, but seeing how nice some of them were, how they hadn't let their hardships break them down, seeing them purely as the human beings they are, I have to say, it was quite cathartic. Yet the visit to the girl's tent was the point at which the trip became more terrifying than I ever imagined it could be. As we approached the girl's tent, the vet greeted someone nearby and asked if a person called Mouse was home. They nodded, but added that she wasn't doing too good. I wasn't sure what they meant by that, but on seeing this mouse girl curled up in a fetal position in her tent, I was almost certain it was drug-related. The vet gently shook the girl awake, and I'm pretty sure she was high from the way she lazily opened her eyes and how out of it she seemed. But then as soon as the guy mentioned Steve's name, the girl shoots wide open, and she gives him this terrified look before saying, I told him not to go. I told him not to, but he didn't listen. Now he's gone." The vet asks her where did she tell Steve not to go? She replies with, "The cemetery," before bursting into tears. The last question we could get her to answer was what happened at the cemetery for Steve to be gone. She replied with, "It took him." It. Not he or they. It. Hearing that word used like that caused this sinking feeling in my stomach. Not so much because of what it entailed, but because this girl was so messed up over what happened, and that obviously meant bad news for Steve. Before leaving the camp, I asked the vet what cemetery Mouse could have been talking about. I had my own idea of which one she was referring to. I just wanted to see if he had the same answer, and he did. He'd said he'd bet his last dime that she was talking about the historic Union Cemetery on Woodside Road. And I agreed because the historic Union Cemetery is right across the street from the hand car wash where Steve was scheduled to have his interview. I took all this information to the police, telling them I was a friend of Steve's before I had them file a missing persons report. I made sure to record the reference number I was giving, as I'd be able to use it to get in touch with whatever detectives would eventually be assigned to the case, I assumed. I tried all throughout that next week to get the relevant cops on the phone, but it seemed to take forever before the case was properly assigned. In the meantime, I thought I'd take a ride down to the cemetery to see if anything caught my eye. I don't really know what I was planning on doing. It's not like I knew anything about being a detective, but at the same time, I couldn't just sit on my butt and do nothing. So, for those of you that don't know, Redwood City's historic Union Cemetery isn't really a cemetery. It did actually function as one until about 1919 or so, but after that it basically became a kind of memorial. From what I can remember, some Civil War soldiers are buried there along with a few famous pioneers, so it's more for tourists and sightseers than grieving families or funeral processions. While walking up and down the gravel paths and checking out the old graves, it occurred to me that when the girl said, Steve is in the cemetery, it might have been her way of telling us that he was dead. There was every chance we just totally misinterpreted that, and I was in that cemetery on a complete fool's errand, wasting my time looking for something I wouldn't find. And if that's the case, what I found and saw next is completely irrelevant. and is naturally to be disregarded. But, and a big but here, if it is connected to the Steve disappearance, it raises questions that honestly don't bear thinking about. So, as I said, I'm walking down this gravel path, and a handful of people I see are just all checking out the statues, taking pictures, and all that other stuff. Only, I see this one guy, all by his lonesome, and he's walking with purpose, with a plastic bag in his hand. When I say walking with purpose, I mean like he wasn't there just to hang around and check out the memorials. He was walking fast, like he wanted in and out in as short a time as possible. Just the sight of him filled me with curiosity, but it's not like if I rushed after him, he wouldn't freak out. So as much as I tried my best to follow him, he slipped away from my view almost as quickly as he had appeared. Only he'd left something behind, the white plastic bag having just dumped it behind one of the bleach-white tombstones, apparently in the hopes that it would remain hidden from public view. At first, I was just mad, like who leaves their trash in a graveyard or whatever. But I went to check out what the bag contained. It just looked like a bunch of organ meat. Like I 100% saw something dark enough to be liver in there, and some of the other pieces looked like chunks of white fat. It smelled real bad too, like he might have been hanging on to it for a couple of days before he'd left it there. To this day, it's probably one of the weirdest things to ever happen to me, finding a bag of meat like that, just abandoned in the middle of a ceremonial cemetery. And like I said, whether or not it's even remotely connected to Steve's disappearance is anyone's guess. I mean, the detectives treated me like I was crazy when I brought it up with them in the weeks that followed. They'd sent some beat cops out to the cemetery and they hadn't found a thing. But I also know they seemed totally clueless in their investigation, like they either didn't care about it or just couldn't get a lead anywhere. And that's just how things went. I get in touch every so often, only to be told the investigator hadn't progressed anywhere. It didn't help that it had taken weeks for anyone to report him missing, and the fact that it was me that should have acted earlier gave me this horrendous sense of guilt for the longest time. Steve had no family out here, and I barely knew anything about him. The best I could do was share the few slivers of info I had with the cops, then just hope it came to something. But it came to nothing, and now Steve is just one more name on the missing persons register, a missing persons register that stretches a mile long. The rate at which homeless people go missing around Redwood City is considerably higher than the surrounding areas, and given how difficult it is to conduct any kind of census or research among the homeless, that figure could be even higher than the numbers suggest. The trouble is, people just don't care. Even people who purport to care about social justice are content to focus their attentions on ridiculous niche topics when homeless people are dying and disappearing on the streets of California every single day. I don't know what's going on out here, whether or not it's just fentanyl killing people off, some kind of serial killer, or something less explainable. But something is killing homeless people at a totally disproportionate rate, and all kinds of other weird stuff is going on to boot. I just pray that whatever it is can be identified and stopped before more people like Steve are lost. People who try so hard to tread water, only to end up slipping beneath the waves. At around 5:15 a.m. on the morning of July 6, 1997, a Starbucks employee arrived at work to open up the Wisconsin Avenue Northwest branch of the world-famous coffee company, situated just north of Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. There was a lot of work to be done before the morning rush, and the employee in question had yet to imbibe their morning espresso to really kick them into gear. So, by their own admission, they were pretty groggy by the time they headed out back to one of the freezer units, intending to fetch some of the breakfast pastries that would go on sale that morning. But when the overtired staff member cracked open the freezer unit, they saw something that made their heart race. Inside was the frozen, lifeless corpse of 25-year-old night manager Mary Catherine Mahoney, along with the bodies of 18-year-olds Emery Allen Evans and Aaron David Goodrich. Although they weren't always on the same shift pattern, the employees knew his slain coworkers well, and the horror of witnessing their frozen, discolored cadavers was almost too much to bear. They raced out of the Starbucks and flagged down a bus driver who was only just beginning his morning route, and given how they could have just called 911 from the on-site telephone, running to find the comfort of another living person is very telling of this person's distraught state of mind. Within 5 minutes of the initial 911 call, police were on scene and taking stock of the situation. All 3 employees had obviously been herded into the rear freezer units before being shot, execution style. But what initially confused the investigation was that not a single cent was missing from the Starbucks. If the motivation wasn't robbery, then it looked a lot like a brutally well-executed targeted killing. But why on earth would someone ambush and murder 3 coffee shop employees during their routine night shift? What made the murders all the more shocking was that Georgetown has been traditionally a low-crime area of Washington, D.C., with local district council member Jack Evans saying to have a triple homicide anywhere in the District of Columbia is an unusual event, but to have a triple homicide in Georgetown is extraordinary, and this has never been a place where crime has been a problem. Over the course of that balmy July morning, scores of blue-uniformed officials made their way to the scene to look for evidence outside the split-level brown brick store. Homicide detectives and forensic technicians alike pored over the scene for hours on end after the bodies were found, working inside and outside the building adorned with the familiar green and black logo. They dusted doors for fingerprints, searched the store, and took statements from local residents in the hopes of piecing together what had happened. But it was only when Mary Mahoney's car was examined that further evidence was found, evidence which indicated that the murders were no random attack. Inside, the car was spotless, save for what looked like signs that Mahoney had recently spent time playing with a pet: a dirty tennis ball, a plastic chew toy, a dog's brush, and a red towel. The only possible indication that something had gone awry was a flat tire on the front passenger's side of the car, evidence that her attacker had made provisions to prevent her from fleeing. Mary was special, her mother later said. She had an enormous heart. She probably would have compassion for the person who killed her. When she moved to Washington several years prior, Mary would jog alone an hour before daybreak, never worrying about being attacked or assaulted. She adored animals, particularly horses, and even took in Marlou, her sister Molly's toothless black and white alley cat. She attended various New York colleges before graduating with honors from Towson State University near Baltimore, and was a loyal and active Democrat, interning for Bill Clinton when he was first elected. Yet according to her mother, it was her managerial job at Starbucks that really excited Mary. She had been employed by the company for 2 years and enjoyed being the manager. She was often seen sweeping the sidewalk in front of the store, and obviously took pride in her store. What she didn't enjoy, though, was disciplining employees, particularly one that Mary had recently dismissed for allegedly stealing several $100s. She struggled with the issue before having to fire him, her mother said, and for a long time, this became homicide detectives' main theory regarding the Starbucks shootings. Yet despite their hard work and determination, they came up short at every turn, eventually turning to the televisual law enforcement institution that is America's Most Wanted. After picking the case up, America's Most Wanted staged a thorough recreation of the murders and detailed many of the theories that police were toying with. They also advertised the number of an anonymous hotline, pleading with those with any information to come forward. And it seems this appeal struck a nerve with one member of the public, who called in with not only a frightening piece of information, but also a rather courageous proposal. In the hours following the broadcast of the Starbucks shootings, a woman called into America's Most Wanted hotline to inform them that she was dating a man who actually knew the shooter firsthand. This mystery person had confessed, even boasted, of committing the murders, and on more than one occasion. The couple had initially taken the man's word as pure bluster, but after seeing the Starbucks shooting edition of America's Most Wanted, it became apparent that he might just be telling the truth. The woman then left her name and numbers so she could be contacted by DC police, and when they did so, she actually agreed to wear a wire for them, in the hopes that she could catch a confession on tape. It was then that they learned their suspect's name: Carl D. Cooper. Cooper lived in Prince George's County near Baltimore City and just on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. itself. He was the son of a church deacon who lived with his wife and son, but at the time, he lived anything but the wholesome life of a family guy. At the time of the Starbucks shooting, Cooper was being charged with attempted murder in a 1996 shooting of an off-duty police officer in Prince George County. As for his family's complicity in his crimes, it turned out that it was Cooper's wife that purchased the 9mm handgun that her husband used to shoot the officer. It was the combination of this and his alleged involvement in the Starbucks shooting that led DC police to wiretap Cooper's home phone. He was arrested after making reference to several local shootings, but insisted that a friend of his named Keith Covington had joined him in the Starbucks robbery, and it was him that executed the 3 victims. However, when they caught up with Covington, they discovered he had been recovering from a gunshot wound at the time of the murder, meaning it was highly unlikely that he was even present on the scene, let alone the one to have done the shooting. "If I killed them, I'd say I killed them," he reportedly said. "But that's not me. I'm not saying I'm a saint, but I'm not going to go out and just kill people. You got to be a dummy or a psycho to do something like that. It's pure evil." When confronted with the evidence of his lies, Cooper admitted to lying about his so-called friend's involvement because he killed 3 people and was afraid to go to jail. In the process of trying to avoid the death penalty, Cooper told the investigators he'd been staking out the Starbucks for about a month, confirming that he acted alone and fired 2 guns, a .38 caliber snub-nosed revolver and a .38 caliber pistol. Cooperating heavily due to the ever-looming threat of the death penalty, Cooper confessed to shooting the manager, Mary Mahoney, when she refused to give him keys to the safe, which held over $10,000 in cash. When she said no, Cooper shot a warning shot into the ceiling, which sent a terrified Mahoney running into the employee hall. Cooper pursued, caught her, and wrestled with Mahoney over her keys. But when her resistance looked like it would be too much to overcome, he shot her dead. He then shot the 2 other Starbucks workers at the store, executing one as they survived the attack and attempted to crawl to safety. Cooper later stated that he wanted to put him out of his pain and misery, but it's more than likely this thinly veiled attempt at showing he had a conscience was nothing but an attempt to dodge the first death penalty charge in over 30 years. During his trial, even when the relatives of the victims wept openly in court, Cooper remained chillingly composed. He also admitted to murdering a 39-year-old security guard named Sandy Griffin during a botched robbery. Cooper had helped Griffin at gunpoint before demanding that the security guard hand over their expensive .40 caliber handgun. But then, fearing Griffin would assault him in the process to defend herself, the serial murderer executed the security guard before quickly fleeing the scene. Cooper admitted to then selling the pistol on the street for $300. Once Cooper was convicted of the Starbucks murders and sentenced to life in prison, Griffin's relatives were no doubt pleased that their loved one's killer had been put away, but they expressed frustration that it had taken 3 more murders, maybe even more, before the killer had been caught. To them, a lack of urgency in the DC police force had cost 3 young people their lives and raised many questions regarding their competence and command. If the account of his defense attorney is to be believed, Cooper is nothing more than a career criminal whose shaky temperament and unbridled greed caused him to take the lives of the innocent. But time and time again, Cooper had the opportunity to simply take the money and walk away, yet he chose not to. He chose to kill people he just didn't need to kill, and he did this on more than one occasion. The first time might have been down to a simple rush of blood to the head, and it's a genuine possibility that killing the security guard was not part of Cooper's plans. But there's also a possibility that killing him proved to be something of a thrill that Cooper wanted to replicate in executing the 3 Starbucks workers.
This happened around 2006 when I was 11 years old. My cousin Aaron was spending the week with my sister and I over summer vacation. At some point during the week, my mom decided to take us all to McDonald's. We ordered and took our food to the back of the McDonald's to sit at a table connected to one of those super long booths along the wall nearest to the bathrooms. Sitting on the same booth, but a few tables down, was an older man sitting by himself. He was probably in his 60s, a bit overweight, balding, and had huge lens 80s style glasses on. He was wearing a dirty t-shirt with gray sweatpants. When we first walked in, I noticed him, but he kept his head down and didn't seem to pay any attention to us, so I kind of blew him off and almost forgot that he was there. My mom had my brother in his car seat by the table and was feeding him french fries. He must have either choked or got sick because he started throwing up all over the place. My mom grabbed him and rushed into the bathroom with him, followed by my sister to help. Aaron and I were left alone at the table. All of a sudden, the old dude looks over at us and starts trying to have a conversation with us. It started with the casual, "Hey, how are you guys doing?" And then he said something about hoping my brother was okay. So we politely responded, thinking that's all that he wanted to say. But then he immediately started getting weird. He asked our ages, which we told him. And then he started asking our names and where our moms worked. So, being kids, we told him that also. The man then looked down at his phone and said that our mom had just texted him saying they would be a while in the bathroom and that he was supposed to bring us home because it was getting late. Although I knew my mom had never even talked to this man once. So even as a kid, I knew something was off. The man then grabbed our hands and said we should hurry. At this point, we were practically being dragged outside. We got outside and this man started leading us into an old run-down white van. He opened the back door and said that we could stay in there for the ride. Luckily, just then, some younger guy had spotted us and instantly went over and told the manager what was going on. As this was happening, my mom and my sister also came out of the bathroom, saw what was going on, and screamed while running outside to us. At this point, we hadn't gotten in the van yet, but the man was trying to push us in. Now hearing my mom's screams, I instantly started pushing back, trying to keep myself from entering. The guy quickly gives up as the manager and my mother are fast approaching. The guy gets in the driver's seat and steps on it with his back door still open. My mom was still yelling at us, and we started crying. We didn't know what to think. To this day, this experience still horrifies me. I don't know why me and my cousin were stupid enough to go along with what this guy was saying, but I'm just glad my mom showed up when she did. My first job was at McDonald's. This building was attached to a gas station and located off of a busy highway. I was 16 and started a 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. shift. This early, the store was usually empty, so only 3 people, myself included, were in the restaurant. These people were my manager, who was in the back, the cook, who was also in the back, and myself, the cashier, who was up front. I was wiping down the counter when a man who looked to be in his mid-30s or early 40s came in. He didn't order anything, but went straight to the restrooms, which were in the restaurant area just around the corner from my cash register. Many truckers and travelers would come in simply to use the washrooms and leave, so this was not an uncommon occurrence. I didn't think much of it, but after the man finished, he came up to the counter and said, "Excuse me, I just used the washroom, and one of the toilets is overflowing." I immediately came around the counter and let him lead me towards the restrooms. Suddenly, I got a horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach and stopped dead in my tracks. I became very aware that no one was in the restaurant area, and the only other 2 people in the store were in the back and wouldn't be able to hear me if I went into the restroom. I felt this overwhelming sense of being lured in. The man had the restroom door open and realized I had paused. He said, "Come on in, I'll show you," which came off innocently enough, but it didn't sit well with me. I smiled and said, "I'll get my manager," and I started making my way back to the counter. "It'll only take a minute," he called out. I met my manager in the back and explained to him that a man was complaining about an overflowing toilet. My manager went to check it out, and I followed closely behind him. When we turned the corner, the man was gone, and we entered the restroom. No toilet was overflowing. We exchanged a look and never brought it up again. As we were leaving the washroom, I glanced into the parking lot, and I saw a car driving away. It was the man. He gave me a terrifying death stare as I drove off. To this day, I don't know what gave me that feeling to not follow the man into the restroom, but I'm glad I stopped to think about what I was doing. The whole situation only lasted a few seconds, but it felt like forever. I was young and trusting, and this man could have done who knows what, and I wouldn't have been hurt. He could have left, got away with whatever it was he had planned, and hit the highway. I got out of work at 6:30 p.m. and went to McDonald's to get an iced coffee. I pulled up to the drive-thru, and there was a red truck in front of me with no cap on the bed. It's super wide, so I can't see the mirrors, and thus can't get a glimpse of who is inside. I'm minding my own business when I noticed that the red truck had pulled up to the second pickup window. I didn't think anything of it, and just assumed they had a big order, and the McDonald's employees asked them to pull up so I could get my iced coffee from the first window. That's when I look up, and I see the truck's reverse lights come on. Okay, they must have pulled a little too far, and are backing up a little. No big deal. They keep backing up, without signaling at all to me. I slowly back up too. Luckily, there was no one behind me. They keep going until they're finally at the first pickup window. The McDonald's employee looks out the window at me, shrugs, and gives me a look like they were just as confused as me. A few minutes goes by. At this point, I'm just thinking about how strange and not a part of common etiquette it was to back up without signaling to anyone that you needed to do so. They could have easily hit me had I not been looking straight ahead. Now, about another 5 minutes goes by. No one is being given any food. I just wanted my iced coffee, and I'm starting to get a little annoyed that they backed up, thinking maybe they were told to go to the second window since I only needed the coffee, but they suddenly felt like refusing to do so would get McDonald's to get them their food faster, and thus they backed up to the first window. I honestly don't know. Anyways, I continue to sit there and wait for my food when I see the driver's side door to the truck open. Out comes a man, like 30 or 40 years old. He was wearing light khaki-colored overalls and a dirty white shirt. He starts walking slowly over to my car. I'm thinking, okay, maybe he's just gonna apologize to me for not signaling when he needed to back up. He gets to my passenger door window, turns so he's facing the window head on, and just stares at me. I'm waiting for him to signal to put my window down, thinking he had something to say, but he doesn't do anything. He just stands there and stares. That's when he starts to lift his hand to the door handle. I quickly lock the door. He immediately starts screaming and continues to attempt to open my now locked door. Not like an angry scream, more like a mentally unstable scream. The guy then goes from trying to open my door to attempting to break my window with his elbow. At this point, I want to drive away, but there was now a car behind me waiting in the drive-thru. I'm too close to both the cars in front of me and the car behind me to be able to drive off. Thinking quickly, I turn off my car, take the keys, and run inside the McDonald's in hopes he doesn't follow me. All the McDonald's employees saw this going down, and when they saw me running inside, they let me hide in the back until the man just leaves. The guy then proceeds to check all the cars in the parking lot to see if they were locked. We instantly called the police, and they were able to detain the guy. It turns out, the guy recently escaped from a mental hospital nearby and stole the car he was driving. The guy was carrying 3 different knives with him when the police detained him. Overall, this experience still scares me to this day. I'm just glad I was able to react fast enough to lock my door before he could open it and do who knows what.
I witnessed someone end their life at McDonald's. It happened a couple of years ago, and I don't really like to think about it too much. I thought sharing my story with people online would make it a little easier, so here it is. This is kind of my attempt to make peace with the situation, and I hope that the soul of this poor man is resting in peace. I don't remember a lot of the details. It all seems really fuzzy, like it was all just a bad dream that never should have happened. I do remember some stuff, though. I remember it was raining. It was 2 weeks before Christmas. I remember that I had just finished working overtime, so it was pretty late. I wanted to grab a quick bite to eat, but didn't feel like eating in my car. I always hate doing that, especially because of the smell, so I went in. I got a Big Mac from McDonald's. I was sitting in the corner of the store when I noticed a really tall man walk inside. He was dressed in standard winter clothes and had a long blue hat on. There was a lot of empty space inside of the hat on top of his head, and I don't remember exactly why it caught my attention. I watched him for a few minutes. I wasn't particularly interested. I was just sitting there eating and didn't really have anything else to look at. My phone was dead, and he was the only other customer in the McDonald's at the time. His body language stood out to me, though. I could tell that he was not in a good frame of mind. I mean, looking at this guy for a minute told you everything you needed to know about him. He was suffering and in a lot of pain. I'm not sure exactly what kind of pain. I could only make guesses. Maybe his wife had left him. Maybe his kids died. I'll never know what happened to him. All I will ever know is that it was bad enough to push him to the very edge, and enough to make him jump off. He stood in front of the cashier for a few minutes while he appeared to be looking at the menu. To this day, I don't know if he was actually considering ordering anything or if he was just waiting for the right moment to. So this was the layout of the store. On one side of the McDonald's, there was the counter where people could order their food, but the counter area didn't take up the entire wall. There was a separation between that and a small hallway that brought you to the bathrooms. I was on the other side of the McDonald's looking on. He had been standing there for a few minutes when he randomly decided to start walking down the hallway. He moved really slowly, like he was really trying to take his time. Step by step, he came closer and closer to death. And the weirdest part about the whole situation was that he didn't seem sad. Didn't feel like he was depressed. It was more of an apathy, like he had suffered so much that he just didn't care anymore, couldn't bring himself to bother with being alive. I don't know, maybe I just feel that way after having thought about this experience so much over the last few years. As he continued down the hallway, he got slower with each step, finally coming to a halt in front of the men's bathroom. He stood there for about 45 seconds. I'm not sure what he was planning on doing. My first reaction was that there was some kind of sign in front of the men's bathroom that it was closed, but that wasn't the case. I saw him pull something out of his coat pocket. He very slowly pointed it at his head. It was a pistol. It wasn't until I heard the gunshot that it registered what was happening. I saw blood go all over the place. His body fell to the floor with a thud. I screamed. I didn't know what else to do. I remember vomiting everything I had just eaten on what was left of my meal. If I hadn't been so disturbed, I would probably have been extremely grossed out, but I was in an absolute state of shock. I started speaking with one of the employees after a few minutes had gone by. He screamed what had happened. I told him that he pulled a gun out of his pocket and shot himself with it. One of the employees there was convinced that he had been shot by someone else, strongly hinting that it was me. I didn't quite understand why they thought so. Some disgruntled old woman, she was old, and told the police that she didn't think that the guy ended his own life. Whatever her motivation was, it really didn't matter. The police didn't take her very seriously from the start, and this obviously was done by his own doing. The security tapes proved as much. I'm not going to lie. It really bothered me that she had to make an already bad situation worse. I already answered some of the questions from the police officers about the story. I remember driving home that night. I remember how alone I felt. This had really taken a toll on me. I pray for that guy's soul every day. I really hope he's in a better place. I can't imagine how horrible things must have been for him that he would have offed himself in a public place like that. I haven't eaten out since this whole experience. I have the strange fear that I'm going to witness another one in public like that. I know it's not rational, but I definitely feel that way. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why this happened, and I probably never will.
There are two types of people who work at McDonald's, or fast food places in general. There are ambitious, intelligent people who are trying to work hard to achieve a goal, in the hopes that one day they'll be able to quit for the sake of something better. And then there are the losers, those with no ambition who have given up and have no desire to achieve anything other than a weekly paycheck. I like to consider myself in the first category. as I was working hard to afford my apartment while taking classes at the local community college. I normally worked the later shifts at the drive-thru window, which is the one spot most employees hated working the most. You constantly have to deal with extremely impatient, oftentimes very rude people who are on their phones or have music blaring, and oftentimes don't realize that I wasn't the individual who took their order, so it's not my fault if it's wrong. In addition to that, you're pretty much constantly on your feet and exposed to the elements. No matter how cold, windy, or rainy it is, you have to keep leaning out into it, wishing that you were in a warm car about to drive away from this place. My point being is please try to be more kind and patient with the drive-thru people. Yeah, some are lazy, but most are trying their best, and even though you only see them for about half a minute, a kind remark or a warm smile might make their day. Anyways, now that I've gotten that off my chest, I work the late shift with two people who I believe qualify for the second category of employees. Connie was a high school dropout who was almost always late and was never invested in what she was doing, and Harold was a deadbeat who often smelled like weed and only kept the job because otherwise his parents would throw him out of the house. He was 32 years old. So one night I was there after 11 p.m. by the drive-thru window on an extremely cold January night, flipping through the pages of my class notes and trying to keep warm by the fry machine. Connie was mopping while looking at her phone, and Harold was in the back probably getting baked in the walk-in cooler. That late at night, we rarely got customers, and if we did, they were almost always zonked-out college kids who used the drive-thru but never physically walked into the restaurant. I stood up and stretched my legs and told Connie that I was heading to the bathroom. It was around 11:30 at this point. I came back less than 5 minutes later, with Connie more or less in the same spot that she was before. I walked past her and turned the corner to return to the window, and froze dead in my tracks. There was a bald man in white face makeup and a black hoodie standing directly outside the window staring in. His eyes were wide, with a blank expression that read, "What kind of trouble can I create?" The figure made direct eye contact with me and smirked, and slammed his palm against the window. I had no idea what to do, and inside my head, the words clown, mime, psychopath, danger, and death all exploded like fireworks. The window was already shut and locked to protect myself from the cold, but the doors were all unlocked, and this person could easily walk right in and grab any one of us if he wanted to. In my head, I kept referring to it as he, but honestly, I had no idea what the gender was. The outfit and makeup made the stranger look androgynous. Maybe that was the point. The figure slapped on the glass window again with its hand. "Open," drawing out the word like a snake. Now, even if the figure wasn't dressed like that, I was under no obligation to open the window. It's unlawful to serve walk-ups at the drive-thru window, certainly for their safety, but also for ours. I shook my head and backed away. I called over my shoulder, "Lock the doors." The whole time, this figure didn't break eye contact with me, and to the best of my memory, I don't even remember it blinking. It drew back its lips in a sinister smile, and I shit you not, its gums were black. I don't mean I was too far away that I couldn't see clearly. I mean its gums were as black as licorice. "Open," it hissed again, louder this time. Its other hand slammed against the window, and it licked its lips with its tongue. "Open." That's when a third hand slammed itself into the window. A left hand, and it was just as pale and as skeletal as the other two. I lost my shit. "Holy shit! Call the cops!" I screamed, and ran back into the office, which was the only room with a locking door and no windows. I heard Connie scream, "What the fuck?" And she dropped her mop and flew across the room and made for the back with me. All the yelling attracted Harold, and I shoved past him into the office and told him to look at the security camera. Sure enough, the white-faced creeper looked to have 3 hands on the window and was tilting its head back and forth, perhaps trying to discover where I ran off to. We locked the office door and called the cops, explaining to the operator that there was at least 2 prowlers outside acting in a threatening manner towards us. I kind of expected it to be over after I called the cops. If it was a prank, they would run once they realized they scared me enough to call 911. But it didn't end there. We watched as the figure left the drive-thru window, circled the building, and made for the restaurant door. "Is there a second one? Look for a second one," I panicked while still on the phone with the operator. Connie was freaking out, and Harold was muttering something about not getting the police involved, likely because he was carrying weed. That's when the power went out. Everything. Cameras, lights, phone, the whole building went down. And barely 10 seconds after we all quieted down after shouting at each other in the dark, we heard footsteps in the dining room area. "Connie, did you lock the doors?" I whispered. She didn't reply. I think she had her hand pressed over her mouth. "Open!" We heard a voice call from outside the room in the dark. "Open!" The shout came at least 3 more times, circling from the kitchen to right off the hallway where we were hiding. I was convinced I was about to die, and every decision I had made in my life that brought me there was flashing before my eyes. We heard footsteps pass the office. After another few minutes, we heard the wail of police sirens outside, and at any moment, we expected to hear gunfire and the police shouting at someone to get on the ground, but we never did. We waited until the police identified themselves, and opened the door and ran out into the parking lot. Since the power was down, we couldn't show the cops the security footage, so we just told them what we saw. They swept the whole building and said it was clear. The owner of that particular franchise store showed up about an hour later, after Harold and Connie had left. I waited for the power to be restored, so an officer could escort me back inside to collect my belongings. The next day my manager called me and asked me to work the night shift. I asked him if the creep from last night had been caught. When he said, "There was no creep," I told him I quit and hung up the phone. This story is completely true. I have no idea what caused the power outage, which apparently erased all the security footage from the day. Without proof on video, my manager and the cops concluded that it was an elaborate prank, but that third hand still bothers me to this day, even more so than its hungry, inhuman eyes. Sure, it could have been a prank, but I wish someone would just confirm that for me, so I can sleep again. Keep your windows locked at night, and if you hear someone tapping from behind the curtains, don't open them. A couple of years ago, I worked at a McDonald's in Kansas. It was a location with a large outdoor play place for the kids. In all honesty, if it wasn't for that thing, I probably would have kept my job much longer. Part of my responsibilities included maintaining the cleanliness and safety of the big, colorful, large, intestine-looking pyramid of tubes and slides. It goes without saying that kids are messy, and whenever one had a bathroom-related accident or there was an injury, I had to go clean and sterilize the thing the best I could. I'm a relatively small person, so I was able to access most of the spots in the play place just fine, and because of that, I knew the maze-like structure very well. It's ironic that I went to school to design skyscrapers, and the closest I ever got to that was becoming an expert with the inner workings of a McDonald's child trap. One night after work, my friend Nate and I decided to hang out and have a smoke before we drove home. The play place was closed even though the restaurant was still open, but instead of sitting in our cars, we unlocked the gate and wandered into the enclosure where the mini playground was, locking the gate behind us. Technically, we probably shouldn't have been doing that, but I felt given how much time and sweat I sacrificed to this thing, I had earned the relative privacy it could provide me. I sat at the base of one of the large tube slides and lit my cigarette, while Nate sat on a bench directly across from me. We had been talking for about 10 minutes. I shifted my weight in preparation to stand up, when from within the slide, something grabbed me hard on the shoulder. What felt like a large hand grabbed my left shoulder, tight enough to make my joints pop, and I felt an index finger and thumb brush the skin of my neck. I screamed and launched myself up and sprinted to the exit, pulling at the door frantically before remembering that it was locked and I had the key. As Nate assaulted me with questions about what just happened, I tried to catch my breath and stared back at the slide, waiting for a fellow coworker to emerge and laugh, having played a great practical joke on me, but nothing happened. I didn't hear a thing from within the structure. I unlocked the gate, walked out, and slammed it shut and locked it again. I ran back into the restaurant and immediately went to the back office to check the security video. The entrance and the spot where I had been sitting was monitored, as were two other angles that showed the majority of the small gated area, but there was still about a third of the structure that we couldn't see. After about 5 minutes of watching the monitors closely, I called a friend of mine who was a cop. He drove in about 15 minutes later, and together we walked back into the play place area, armed with flashlights and mace. We examined the entire structure. Not only was there no one there, but there were no signs that anyone had been hiding inside or had broken in. I was at a complete loss for words and feeling very foolish, but I knew with certainty that I had been grabbed. I barely slept that night, and the following morning I came in early to review the entire tape from the previous night. Not once did anyone emerge from the slide or the gate. Before we opened the place to the kids again, myself and the biggest coworker I had went through the whole thing again, but again, there was nothing found. The play place is completely enclosed within a fenced-in area, with only one gate leading in or out. The fence is around 8 feet high, not impossible to climb, but it would be extremely difficult. To this day, I'm still at a loss to explain what happened. Some people I tell this to are convinced I experienced something paranormal and that the play place is haunted. Others think I'm the victim of an extremely well thought out practical joke. At this point, I wouldn't even be angry to discover that. I'm just desperate to learn how it was done. I quit the job about 4 or 5 months after the incident. What bothers me the most is that if there was a living, breathing person there, they would have had to silently prop themselves up in that slide, fighting gravity, barely making a sound or breathing for me to have missed them, and then after they grabbed me, climbed back up the tunnel without making a sound. I didn't hear a whisper of movement behind me, or even feel the faintest hint of breath on the back of my neck. I really hope one day to discover the truth behind what happened, and why.
I'm not really sure who came up with the idea first, but by day's end, we'd planned the destination and date. Although I've been camping many times before, I'm almost positive neither Chuck nor Glenn ever had. They had come into the family late in life, and my real dad had already died by then. He had been the guy who loved camping. My stepfather, not so much. Don't get me wrong, he's a great man, but the outdoors has never been his deal. The list of supplies needed for the trip was compiled and followed to the letter, including the 4 cases of beer, perhaps the most important of all the goods. We'd loaded up and were ready to leave at dawn the next morning. As we headed out, we had no idea what lay ahead of us, and how it would affect our connection to one another, a connection we once believed to be unbreakable. The 3-hour drive was uneventful and quiet. I was pleased to see how dry the surroundings were. Fire starting, while not hard for me, wasn't my strong suit, and I knew neither of my brothers had ever burned more than a cigarette. I brought along some lighter fluid just to be safe, although I never ended up needing it. While I worked on the fire, Chuck and Glenn put the knowledge they had learned watching YouTube videos to use, setting up the tent. I had purposely got the easiest tent I could find, yet it still took the better part of an hour before they had it up. The fire was already roaring by the time they joined me. I had buried the potatoes in the coals, prepared the steaks to be cooked, and was well into my second beer by then. The steaks didn't take long, and by dark, we were sitting down to a delicious meal. After dinner, the real camping began. I had chosen to camp out in the middle of nowhere on purpose. I knew we'd become obnoxious and loud when we got drunk, and more importantly, I like to make big bonfires and turn my music up loud. You can't do that with others around you. That evening turned out to be a blast. We blew through 2 cases and didn't pass out until dawn. It was something I needed to do for a long time. And despite the hangover, I resolved then and there it was something we were going to do much more often. When I finally drugged myself from my sleeping bag, it was well past noon. Chuck and Glenn were already awake, sitting next to a cold fire. They both had a beer in their hand and looked happy to see me. I asked them what was up with the fire, and Chuck mumbled something about not being able to get it relit. This made me chuckle. I walked over to the tree line and grabbed an armful of wood. When I returned, I set it down on the dead coals and blew onto them. The coals lit up brightly, and the fire was roaring again within a few minutes. Then I went to the creek to fetch some water. The look on their faces was priceless. Chuck's jaw was hanging open, and I could tell Glenn was aching to ask me how I did it. While I waited for the water to boil, I cooked up a large mess of eggs and potatoes, and we ate breakfast with a cup of coffee. Once I had eaten, I was feeling much better and suggested that we go fishing. We didn't make it back to camp until almost dark. Unfortunately, no one had caught anything that we could keep, but I could tell Chuck had already caught a good buzz. I cooked what was left of the steak, and after, we set to finishing what was left of the beer. This evening was much tamer than the one before. I didn't want to make a big fire. It would only be harder for me to put it out completely before we left for home. Most of the night, the three of us talked about unimportant things like girls and work. Around 2 a.m, we decided to turn in, the beer long being drunk. My last memory was Chuck going out to take a leak. He had drunk a lot more than Glenn or I. He fell several times trying to get out of his bag, but eventually made it out of the tent. I must have passed out just after that. The next thing I remember, the sun was already beginning to shine through the trees. I had to pee like crazy, so I fumbled my way to the zipper, trying not to wake the other two. As I unzipped the tent, a weird burning smell, similar to burned meat, hit me. I figured one or both of the guys were already up and burning our breakfast. I looked behind me, and only Glenn was still asleep. Chuck must have been the one cooking, and he was terrible at it. I crawled out with a smirk on my face and a smart remark for him. I looked up expecting to see my brother burning food, but was met with a sight far more serious and horrible than I could have ever imagined. The fire was burned out, and Chuck was nowhere to be seen. The dawn was still too dim to make out the large object laying across the dead coals. I walked up, within a few steps, and was hit fully by the burning smell. Then all of a sudden, it hit me what I was seeing. Chuck was lying face down across one corner of the cold fire, and he wasn't moving. Without a second thought, I grabbed his body and rolled it over. All I could see was black and smelled the terrible burning. I began yelling for Glenn, and when he didn't answer immediately, I ran into the tent and shook him. He was reluctant at first, but when I yelled that Chuck was freaking dead, loudly in his face, he jolted upright and asked me to repeat it. All I could do was point toward the remnants of the fire and the horrible vision that the sun was making clearer by the minute. He flew from the tent in one quick motion and came almost face to face with the charred body of our dead brother. I stood behind him and silently with my eyes closed. Glenn fell to his knees and started wailing. At that second, I wanted to be anywhere but there. The sound of Glenn's haunting wails and the horrible smell permeating the air was worse than any nightmare I could have ever imagined. A cold breeze was blowing across me, and that was when I first realized that I had peed myself. It didn't matter, though. With every second, the sight became clearer, and I was too terrified to open my eyes. This was not the way I wanted to remember Chuck. I eventually crawled back into the tent and started crying myself. This continued for God knows how long, until I figured I should call 911 and let them know what had happened. They arrived about an hour and a half later. When the coroner left with his body, I summoned up the courage to come out. Glenn was speaking to one of the officers. The smell was still so bad. I began retching and retreated back to the tent. Soon after, another officer joined me inside the tent. We talked about the trips and events of the night before, nothing in particular. He left about 20 minutes later with the remaining officers. I began breaking down camp, and Glenn soon joined me. As we worked, nothing was said between us. I moved as fast as possible, hoping to soon be away from the terrible smell of my brother's burning flesh. Looking back on it now, I'll acknowledge that I may have looked a bit cold and uncaring. In my defense, I was the oldest and had the responsibility of notifying the rest of the family. I knew our mother was going to be crushed, and I wanted to tell her before she heard it from the news. When it comes to Glenn, I can't speak for how he was feeling or what he was thinking. No one has the right to dictate to another how to handle their grief, especially in a circumstance such as this. Telling Mom was as bad as I had imagined. She always wanted a large family. When Dad died, she thought her dream was over. However, when she met my stepfather and he mentioned adoption, she was overjoyed. Chuck and Glenn were actual brothers, about 2 years apart and in their early teens when Mom found them. Boys their age are usually hard to adopt out, but Mom had fell in love with them at first sight. I always considered them my blood, as did the rest of my family. Glenn and I stayed close to her for some time, knowing how hard Chuck's loss was on her. This was the first instance I began to get the feeling Glenn harbored suspicions towards me. Nothing was said, but I caught him watching me with his usual questioning look many times throughout that month. As the months passed and more questions began to be raised, many more than I care to mention here, I had always assumed Chuck had passed out or tripped or fell into the fire, killing him. He had been much drunker than us. However, when the results came back from the medical examiner, certain things were off. The bruises, for instance. Chuck's back was covered in them. The thing was, Chuck played rugby with some guys from school and had for many years. Also, his skull was fractured. A worrying sign for sure, but even the doctors were forced to admit that things like this happen in a fire. A skull bursts or cracks from the heat. Horrible facts to hear, I agree, but for some reason they have cemented the suspicions in Glenn's mind. No matter how hard I tried to show him this is the wrong time to be apart, he convinced himself I had something to do with our brother's death. I've had my own reservations towards Glenn and his relationship with Chuck, more than once. I saw them argue about something, but they stopped whenever I entered the room. I do have my own suspicions. Yes, but now is not the time to fracture the family. Our mother needs us more than ever right now. If she became aware of the distrust between us, it would not only break her heart, it may actually just kill her. For the foreseeable future, I'm going to do my best to bring us back together. If not for our mom's sake, perhaps Chuck's. On my own, I'm going to keep digging into the rift between the two brothers, and if it led to Chuck's death, even if it yields something terrible, truth that I may not want to be aware of, I owe it to him. After all, Chuck was my brother too. My life growing up was far from good. Rather than constant physical abuse, although there was that too, my parents ignored me most of the time. Both had drinking problems. My mom only worked part-time so she could, as she said, be there for her kid. But she really spent the majority of her free time in a bottle or bed. My dad was the main breadwinner, working as a over-the-road truck driver. He was away most of the time, leaving me alone to take care of myself. Our apartment was on the edge of town, surrounded by miles of forest. As long as I can remember, I was entranced by those woods. It wasn't long before I was spending my days exploring them. My love of nature only grew from there. I soon realized neither of my parents were paying attention to my comings and goings, so I began camping out in the woods overnight, here and there just to see if I'd be missed. But as I figured, I wasn't. From there, I began spending weeks at a time camping throughout the vast forest. We all know all good things must end, and one morning, I was caught walking out of the woods by my father. He'd just arrived back from time on the road. It was early, and he was livid to see his 12-year-old son walk out of the woods at 5 a.m. on a school day. In addition to tanning my hide, I got an earful from them both. This didn't stop me from returning, though. After laying low around home for a week, I waited for my dad to leave and my mom to drink. When I was sure she was asleep, I fled back to my real home. I would slip back early every morning prior to school without anyone noticing. It didn't take long for things to go back to the way they had been before. If I wasn't at school, I was out roaming the woods. I mentioned before I had a series of camps throughout the forest. Early on, I realized I was sharing my getaway with others. Among these interlopers were small groups of homeless people, probably way before I came along. They'd use the woods as a place to camp and drink, away from the prying eyes of the police and public. I made the mistake of staying in the same place too long on one occasion and almost got assaulted because of it. After that run-in, I moved my camps to the other side of the river. Some nights I would lurk in the shadows and watch them destroy themselves with drugs and drink. Many times, violence would break out, and this only reinforced my hate for them. I already saw enough of that at home anyway. As the months passed, I moved deeper into the vast forest, always looking for a new place to explore. Summer came, and with it, more homeless. It wasn't long before they had their filthy little camps all over the woods. However, at that point, I was still safe if I stayed on my side. I was the only person who knew where to cross. River or not, my paradise would be taken away from me, once and for all, by these very same people. One hot summer afternoon, I was down on the banks getting water. I'd heard voices off in the distance, so was keeping my eyes peeled. I'd retrieved my water and was returning back to my camp when I heard a group of people arguing on the opposite side. Curious, I hid and watched. There was a raggedy tent set up, and next to it, 3 men and 1 female yelling at one another. They were too far away for me to make out much of what was said. They all looked like they were drunk, swaying around while they argued. I stayed around for about 10 minutes when one of the men hit another over the head with a beer bottle. The man staggered and fell to the ground. I waited for the man on the ground to move, but he didn't. The assailant then picked up a big rock and threw it down on the man while the others just stood by and watched. He did this over and over, about 3 times, until he looked too exhausted to continue. I had to stifle a scream as I watched this horror unfold, and by now was too scared to move. The female then yelled something at the man and slapped him on the chest. He looked unfazed and instead just stared down at the mess he'd just made. After a minute of doing this, the others yelled something again at him, and they all ran away together. I could finally breathe, but still dared not move in case they returned. I stayed hidden for what seemed like hours before I decided they weren't coming back. I expected the man on the ground to get up, but now I know how stupid that was. I got the crazy idea in my head that I needed to get him help. Drunk bum or not, he was still a human, and I ran the entire 3 miles back to our apartment. For some reason, I was happy to see my father was home. I ran in, short of breath, and began yelling for my parents. I noticed them sitting together on the couch and ran up to them. My dad told me to shut up and then asked me what the matter was. I repeated the story of what I had just witnessed in the woods. Rather than getting help, my dad began yelling at me about defying him. My slurring mom soon joined in, and they both commenced to chewing me out a new a-hole. The worst part was when my mother accused me of making up stories to get attention. I denied this, of course, but she wasn't listening. The rest went the way it always did. My dad pulled off his belt and strapped me across until I began crying, and he told me to shut up or give me something to cry about, as usual. It was clear to me the discussion was over. The man wasn't getting helped. After all, I was just a stupid kid. I crawled off to my bedroom and cried myself to sleep as I had done so many times. My retreats to the woods had ended. I couldn't leave the house without one of my folks, and going outside was out of the question. Not long after that, I was shipped off to live with my dad because I'd become too much for my parents to handle. I expected life to be much as it had before, maybe even worse. After all, there had to be a reason why my mother was so messed up. I kept my guard up for a long time, waiting for the first beating to come. Instead, I would be given a life I could have never dreamed of. Grandpa Mac turned out to be a loving and patient man, the exact opposite of any adult I'd ever met before. The first time he asked me what I liked to do, I was speechless. No one ever cared to ask. I swallowed the knot in my throat and told him of my love for nature. Expecting the usual laughing and mockery, I braced, but instead his face lit up. He spent the next hour telling me of all the great memories he had of camping with his father. I knew then I had become the luckiest kid in the world. As soon as the spring came, we spent every waking moment hiking the woods and parks throughout the country. The knowledge he passed on to me could fill a library full of books. Even though he's gotten too old for us to go out together, I still visit him on a regular basis and share all the amazing adventures I have been through recently. His body may be weak, but his mind is still as strong as ever. I owe that man more than I'll ever be able to repay, and he did everything just because he loved me. It still took me a good 3 or 4 years until I summed up the courage to tell him the story. Also, I expressed the guilt I felt for keeping it to myself all this time. I was unsure of how he'd react. At first, he sat quietly. A moment or two later, he sat up in his chair and hugged me tightly. This confused me, and when he let me go, I asked him what I should do. His advice to me was to contact the police back home and share the story with him. After that, the responsibility was out of my hands, and I didn't need to be guilty ever again. Once I contacted them, I washed my hands of the guilt. Now that I've grown up, I realize my parents were at fault. I did what I should have. If they chose to say nothing, it was on them. I went off to college, and upon my return at Christmas, Mac let me know that the people responsible had been found, although all but the woman were dead. She shared the location of the man's body with detectives. They wanted to thank me for coming forward and helping them to solve this case after all these years. And with that, I moved on, leaving that terrible part of my life behind me. Until recently, with the death of my father, which seems to have dredged up all these old memories, I'd not thought of that part of my life in some time. My love for the woods and its creatures has grown into my livelihood. Now I get to travel all over, discovering and preserving the world's wild places before they are gone. Something I could have only dreamed of as a kid, trapped inside a run-down apartment in New Jersey. And without Mac's love, understanding, and teaching, none of it would have ever happened. The argument started the same way every time. You'll never catch me dead in a national park. They're full of nothing but fat tourists and RVs. I'm from the old school, and I like it that way. Old school was a kind description of how he camped. If it was made from anything other than canvas or leather, he considered it newfangled junk. My mother tried on multiple occasions to introduce things as common now as nylon tents, but he wasn't having it. He'd rather carry that big, musty wall tent everywhere we camped, and don't get me started about the stinking cans of kerosene that always leaked all over everything. He was certainly a man born too late. The term roughing it had to have been coined with him in mind. We continued to suffer through his archaic ways of experiencing the outdoors until the near death of my younger brother showed him the error of his ways. Throughout the early 80s, my dad would drag us out to the national forest during Thanksgiving. The weather was relatively mild for this time of year, and the forest was beautiful. I can still smell the pine trees. These retreats always seemed to coincide with the hunting season for some reason. I remember hearing Dad used to hunt before meeting our mom. I think she forbade him from doing it anymore, so this was his way of sticking it to her. Either way, gunshots near camp were a common sound. I guess because our parents grew up with very little oversight, me and my brother Mike's childhood was the same. No one considered that it may be dangerous with a bunch of trigger-happy guys around to let 2 young boys play in the woods alone. It was normal for the 2 of us to leave camp at dawn, play all morning until lunchtime, then go back out until supper. We've been doing this as long as I can remember, and no one batted an eye. On one specific Thanksgiving, we had been running and crawling through the underbrush all day. This was during the time G.I. Joe and Rambo movies were at the height of their popularity. Mike and I loved dressing up in our camouflage clothes and playing war. Mike's birthday had been just a few days before, and he got a pair of G.I. Joe walkie-talkies. Looking back, they were junk, but we loved them. After lunch, we returned to the woods. I can't remember exactly what I was doing at that moment, but I know Mike was trying to sneak up on me. I was sitting on a fallen tree and suddenly heard a loud bang, quickly followed by a whistling go by my head. I dropped flat on my stomach and waited for another shot. I wasn't sure what was happening, but something told me to stay where I was. No more than 30 seconds had passed when I heard faint moaning in the distance. Since Mike was missing at that second, I called him on the walkie-talkie. No answer came, but I heard a new noise. This sounded like my name, so I called to Mike again. No answer. Now I was getting scared. Without any other ideas, I yelled out his name. I told him the game was over and he needed to answer me. I wasn't sure if he was still trying to trick me or was in real trouble. I listened very intently, but nothing but the faint rustle of leaves could be heard. I walked in the direction of the rustle and listened again. Nothing. So I called out again. The rustling repeated, followed by another moan. I ran in that direction about 20 yards and stopped. The rustling came again, just to my right and very close. I couldn't see anything, so I dropped my stomach and scanned the ground. About 3 feet away, I spotted the bottom of a Nike. I knew it had to be Mike's. I ran to the bush he was laying under. The sight I came upon still breaks my heart to this day. There was Mike, staring up at me with a terrified look on his face. Just under his arm was a hole with blood pouring out of it. It shocked me, but I did my best to play it cool. I didn't want to make him any more scared than he already was. Had I been older, I may have known better how to move him, but I just reached down and scooped him up in my arms. He was too heavy for me, but I was going to do my best to save him. I made it about 100 yards before I had to set him down. He must have been in considerable pain. He asked me to leave him there and go get help. His voice sounded very weak, and I almost broke into tears right there. Somehow, I held myself together and ran another mile or so without stopping. Mom must have known something was wrong. She yelled out in a panicked voice for my father. My dad came out of the tent, took one look at me and said, "How bad is it?" I was too winded to speak. I just pointed him toward where I'd set him down and he took off. By the time I'd caught up, Dad was already picking him up and headed for camp. The entire ride to the hospital, Mom kept talking to him, telling him to hold on. I rode in the back seat, holding my shirt against the wound the whole way there. What would have normally been at least a 30-minute drive took us just under 20. Dad handed him off to the doctors. They had him in surgery within the hour, and the next 3 were a long, living nightmare. More shocked at what had happened to my brother, I was in amazement at how calmly my parents were handling everything. Having become a parent since, I realized they were far from calm, but they handled it well either way. It was after midnight when the doctor gave us the news. They had been touch and go for a long time. I only found out much later that Mike had died more than once during surgery, but Mike had a good chance of recovering completely. The police, having been notified of the shooting, arrived soon after dawn to question us. Now that the urgency of the situation had passed, I broke down several times during my recollection. That was the first time I came to grips with the possibility that I could have been shot myself. Mike was going to be in the hospital for a few weeks, so my parents got a hotel room nearby. I think my dad considered staying at the camp, but after a very short discussion with my mom, he decided against it. The detectives handling the case kept us up to date, but as late as the day Mike was discharged, no names had been connected to the case. The most widely held theory is that a poacher mistook the movement in the bushes for a deer and fired. It accounts for the red flags during the search through hunting licenses. It wasn't the first time this happened, and sadly won't be the last. Mike was one of the fortunate ones. 34 years have passed since then, and nobody has been decisively connected to the shooting. Mike did make a full recovery and went on to start his own business and family, just like any other normal person. Something great did actually come out of this mess. We never returned to the national forest, and even better, Dad decided with all of those fat tourists with their RVs being around, it was a safer environment for he and his family. Between 12 and 17, I got to spend my holidays in awesome places like Yosemite and the Grand Canyon. This is the way I'd always thought camping should be, peaceful and quiet, and I'm almost positive Mike would agree with me. I'm 21 and a type 1 diabetic. When I was around the age of 5 and 6, I would go to this diabetes camp for daytime. My mom would drop me off during the day and pick me up around noon or so. I remember doing lots of activities such as fishing, playing Twister, but one activity we would do sticks out to me most: swimming. This sticks out the most because when I was going to camp around 5 or 6, there was a teen male counselor. I don't remember his name, so we'll just call him Jay. Jay had a split tongue, and every time I was in my swimsuit getting ready to swim, Jay would look at me with such hunger in his eyes. When I would walk past him as he would be sitting in a booth, he would always say how good-looking I looked and would wink at me. Jay would also try to get me to go places with him where no one was around. Now, when I was young, I didn't go off with anyone except for those who I knew. I was a shy, tiny child. One day, while me and my group were swimming, my counselor told me it was time to head inside. I was having a low episode, so I told her no. I am still very feisty when I'm low, and next thing I knew, I woke up in the camp infirmary. I had passed out in the pool from being low, and the lifeguard for the camp got me out and did CPR. When I was walking out, I saw Jay, and he asked me if she did mouth-to-mouth with me, and that it was hot if the lifeguard did. When my mom got me that day, I told her I didn't want to go back to the camp because I felt homesick. Yes, I did lie, but I felt that if I told her the truth, she wouldn't have believed a kid over an adult. Flash forward to 2019, I told her everything, and she apologized for those things happening and asked why I didn't tell her. And I just told her I was too afraid that no one would believe me. I don't know if this man remembers what he did, but I hope he hasn't trapped any other children. A couple of years ago, me and my boyfriend were looking at this budget Airbnb for a weekend in Berlin. It wasn't the nicest place we'd seen, but to us it was just going to be a place to get some sleep in between hours of exploring Berlin. We'd hardly be there basically, so we figured we'd go for it. When it comes to paying for the rental stuff, there's a problem with my boyfriend's card details, so we decide to use mine. Then there's a problem with my card details too, so we try using PayPal. That doesn't work either, and we can't work out what's going on because we definitely had the money in our accounts. It must have been a problem with Airbnb's payment services or something. But tell that to the owners, who ended up getting really annoyed with us because we'd already basically agreed to rent the place via verbal agreement. By the time we got our bank stuff sorted, turned out it was fraud on both our accounts. They weren't interested in renting to us anymore, so we missed out. Or so we thought. Ages and ages later, my boyfriend sends me a link to an article from a German newspaper telling me to get it up on my iPad so I could use Chrome to translate it. But before I actually used the translate feature, I scrolled through the whole article like, why did he send this to me for? And lo and behold, there's a picture of the Airbnb we wanted to rent. Only then did I translate the text, so it was only after that I read that 2 parents and their young baby had died in a carbon monoxide leak that occurred overnight in the bloody Airbnb we were going to stay in. I'm not religious or anything, never have been, but I kinda get what people are talking about now when they mention guardian angels or whatever. If it hadn't have been for that annoying fraud, we'd have rented the flat, and it might have been us that were there when the gas leak happened. I was just absolutely horrified when I read through the story, and I was crying like a baby by the end of it. It said the owner had been arrested over it, that he was going to be charged with some variant of manslaughter or whatever, and rightfully so if you ask me. I still get chills when I think about it though, and obviously we just stick to hotels these days. Not that they're any safer, but it just makes me feel safer, you know? Because when I picture that poor family who went to bed one night and never woke up again, all because some cowboy landlord was too cheap to service the flat. Ugh, it doesn't bear thinking about. In October of 2017, the 36-year-old Australian Remice Januzzi was going through a rather rough time in his life. He had been working as a bricklayer in recent years, but a long drawn-out struggle with illegal substances had resulted in Remice's lifestyle and health deteriorating rapidly. Drastic measures were needed and fast, but to his credit, Remice had the presence of mind to understand that he needed to break from his old life entirely. And so, Remice downloaded the Airbnb app and started browsing affordable, rentable properties around his home city of Melbourne. Remice didn't have a particularly large budget, so when he found a room for rent at a very reasonable price, he leapt at the chance to rent it. To Remice, it didn't matter that the place had a couple of less than glowing reviews. He didn't care if the atmosphere wasn't friendly. He didn't care if the plumbing looked dodgy. He just needed somewhere that was away from his old haunts so he wouldn't be tempted to feed his addictions. What exactly happened during Remice's first 2 weeks in the property isn't exactly clear, but it seemed that Remice's roommates and he didn't exactly see eye to eye. There was no kind of confrontation or animosity between them, but we know for certain that at some point, Remice complained to a friend that he didn't like the vibes between himself and his housemates. Yet despite their apparent bad vibes, Remice chose to extend his stay in the property, which added an extra 210 Australian dollars to his bill. Yet on his final day at the property, Remice was horrified to find that he had no money in his bank account. It was later claimed that this was because his employer had forgotten or neglected to pay him, but regardless of the reason, Remice had to face the music and tell the landlord that he didn't have the money to pay him. The landlord, a man named Jason Colton, was no fan of Remice. He was apparently extremely suspicious of his demeanor and had long suspected that he would be unable to pay the extra money to stay in the property's spare room. Yet there's no way that Remice could possibly have suspected the extreme nature of Jason's reaction. He figured they'd be able to work something out, delay payment by a couple of days until Remice could get in touch with his employer. But it seems that Jason was not in the mood to discuss the matter like a gentleman, and what should have been a simple discussion turned into a living nightmare for Remice Januzzi. Just as Remice was planning on talking to the landlord about his current financial situation, Jordan and the two other young men who lived at the property burst into his room to confront him. They had heard Remice packing his belongings in the bedroom and assumed he was about to do a runner, as one of them later phrased it, which is why they seemed to be heading him off before he could do so. Remice apologized profusely before showing Jason a banking app on his phone, illustrating that he didn't have the money he owed. He offered to get in touch with his employer, and that he could probably get the money over to Jason over the days that followed. As he spoke, Jason's features turned from pale pink to deep red, and as he finished talking, his rage erupted in a fiery display of pure wrath. Jason grabbed hold of Remice by the throat and pushed him up against the wall, choking the young man violently as he tried in vain to free himself. Jason wasn't exactly a giant, but he still towered over the small stature of Remice, on top of being considerably stronger than him. It was with Remice being in this completely helpless position that Jason began to pummel him mercilessly, throwing his fists into his face over and over again until his nose and cheekbones were broken. What became clear much later is that Jason simply did not believe that Remice didn't have his money. The landlord had gotten it into his head somehow that Remice was trying to somehow get one over on him by showing him an empty bank account, when really he had the money stashed somewhere else. Jason continued to brutally assault Remice with the help of the two other men that resided at the property, and at some point, the confrontation spilled out into the front yard. The neighbor that had called the police later said that they saw a man limping from the front door of the property, one who was trying to scream but was unable to do so thanks to being choked by the enraged Jason Colton. Remice tried all he could to escape, but Jason continually dragged him back onto the lawn, demanding that he check his bank account again to prove he wasn't lying. But when Remice once again showed him an account with less than 10 Australian dollars in it, instead of calming down and figuring something out, Jason's rage was renewed. Only this time, he wanted not just to physically hurt Remice, but to humiliate him too. The landlord then took a plastic pencil case from Remice's belongings, stripped him half naked, then proceeded to shove the pencil case somewhere it really didn't belong. But Jason wasn't done yet. He began choking Remice, demanding he pay the rent money that was owed, but Remice was in no state to form a cohesive sentence. Instead of letting go to give him a chance to speak, Jason continued to keep Remice in a chokehold. Remice passed out, never to awaken again. With Remice in the mortuary, Jason was charged with first-degree murder. A neighbor of his later testified that the disturbance was so loud that she could hear it from a few houses away, the distinct sound of a man screaming at the top of his lungs. It sounded like aggressive male behavior, she told the prosecutor, and I wasn't going anywhere near that. The prosecution had ample evidence of Jason's guilt, as his police interviews are a disturbing mess of lies and counterclaims until he is confronted with the fact that his victim had actually passed away. At that, Jason stated that Remice deserved everything he got. But Remice didn't fight back. He didn't pose a threat to the landlord at any stage. He was mercilessly beaten and choked to death on the front lawn of a small suburban home, all for just a few $100s. The jury saw Jason for what he was, the lowest kind of scum, and convicted him of murder before a judge handed him an 11-year prison sentence. When we use services like Airbnb, we take a great deal of comfort in the flashy website and lose ourselves in the glossy photographs of our potential rentals. We're quick to forget all the company is doing is hooking us up with other regular people, and that pretty much anyone can post an advertisement. How many other people like Jason are out there? How many other violent psychopaths are renting rooms to unwary strangers who would turn from tenants to victims at the first provocation? We should definitely all be careful who we interact with on websites like Airbnb, because we might be renting rooms we'll never leave. Okay, so this might sound like a bit of a weird one, because not like a spooky story. Our Airbnb wasn't haunted or anything, and I don't believe in stuff like that to begin with. But when me and my girlfriend stayed at an Airbnb in Belgium, something happened that creeped us out so much that we had no choice but to leave the apartment and check into a hotel. I've had a mate of mine tell me I overreacted over this, but just put yourself in my shoes. First proper morning of our little weekend getaway to Bruges. Me and the old ball and chain are getting ready to go out for breakfast when we realized that neither of us had packed any toothpaste. It was one of those I figured you'd do it kind of things. But it was no big drama, since we could just brush our teeth and help ourselves to sketchy mints the owners had left for us. But I do remember my girlfriend looking around in the bathroom just in case the owner had left us any and saying some throwaway thing like, "I wish they'd left us some toothpaste." Boring, I know. I'll get to the point. We go out for breakfast, have our wander around Bruges, grab some toothpaste, then head back to the Airbnb. That night, I go to take a shower before bed and saw that my girlfriend had picked up the weirdest toothpaste that I've ever come across in my entire life. Honest to God, it looked like something you'd get out of a Second World War ration pack with this eye-watering old-fashioned menthol smell to it. I have my shower, walk back into the bedroom where my girlfriend is half asleep, and I kinda poke fun at her for buying vintage toothpaste. She's knackered and half asleep like, "What are you on about?" telling me to shut up and go to sleep, etc., etc. I had a wee giggle to myself, then got into bed and tried to get some sleep. It was the weirdest thing, because how did she not realize she picked up such weird old toothpaste? And that's when it hit me. She didn't. She didn't realize because she didn't buy it, which means someone else bought it and then put it in our room, which meant that someone was listening to my girlfriend when she was in the bathroom, and it's not like the place was small and the bathroom was near the front door to the apartment or something. God forgive anyone who wake up my missus in the middle of the night, but I decided the circumstances warranted waking her up. She was annoyed at first, telling me to leave her alone, but once I explained the situation, she just sat up rigid in bed, like completely freaked out. We racked our brains as to how someone might have heard us, but couldn't come up with anything. Like I said, the place wasn't small and the walls were pretty thick. So how had someone heard us? The landlord lived miles away, and as far as we knew, no one else had keys. It's something that bothers me to this day, to be honest. But I still can't work out how someone heard us. And I did ask the landlord about it, who told me no one had been in the apartment. We were convinced it was him, though, enough to just pack our stuff and leave. I know he hadn't exactly brandished a knife at us or anything. What happened would most likely make for a terrible horror movie, but like I said before, put yourself in my shoes. Someone is listening to you when you go to the toilet, and for all you know, they're watching you too. And God knows why they're doing it, but it can't be a good, wholesome reason. 1,000 nopes. Seriously. Just thinking it over had me and my girlfriend getting out of there. It didn't ruin the trip too much, like we realized early what was going on, so I think we got off quite lightly. The extra hotel money was the real scary part, though.
This past Christmas was me and my girlfriend's 3-year anniversary. We don't typically do much, so this year we decided to make it special by planning a romantic getaway. At the time, the two of us were living in Wyoming, and we rented a cabin in the snowy mountains for the weekend. We found the cabin on Airbnb with a hot tub, and we were instantly sold. The cabin was in the middle of pretty much nowhere. The nearest other house was a half-mile away. To get to it, you had to drive down a small, removed, private road. We got to the cabin, and we both looked at each other, not thinking it was going to be that desolate. But we quickly brushed it off, as the cabin was amazing. We went inside, and there was a booklet with all the cabin's info outlined. The book said that during the snowy season to not be surprised if their contracted snowplowers showed up to clear off the driveway. Alright, well that was fine, we both thought. We unpacked, and quickly realized there was no service on either of our phones, though the booklet in the cabin told us that there was a landline if we needed anything. We spent the first night by the fire playing board games and drinking wine. It was honestly really nice. The weekend was exactly what we needed. Now, at this point, it was only 6 p.m. We planned to spend the next night in town, and this night, I booked us a reservation for a nice dinner. We were gone for quite a while, not returning till about 10. Dinner was great, and we were excited to head back to the cabin for some champagne and hot tubbing to end off the night. Now, something that should be mentioned is it had been snowing all day. As we were driving back, we both took notice to how much more snow had piled up outside. We drove down the private road and got to the driveway, though I stopped the car in front of the house with my headlights shining. My girlfriend looked at me confused. There were clearly fresh tire tracks on the driveway, and I asked her if she saw them too. We both knew this couldn't have been us, as we hadn't even driven on the driveway itself, just the nearby street. Immediately though, we remembered the snowplowers that could have stopped by, but the issue was, we saw the tire tracks because of the snow. And who plows the snow in the pitch black dark? We also knew that once we were at the cabin, we had no cell service on our phones. We both agreed to head back into town and message our Airbnb host, and ask him if one of his friends had stopped by the cabin. We got into town and sent over a text. We proceeded to wait for a reply, but unfortunately, we didn't hear back. We could have called, but at that point it was past 10, and we didn't want to be disrespectful guests. We figured we blew the whole thing out of proportion, and might as well head back to the cabin. We just figured we must have been psyching ourselves out over nothing. We drove back, and this time we actually drove up on the driveway. As we got out of the car, my stomach dropped as I noticed fresh footprints on the property. From what it looked like, someone had drove up on the driveway, parked, and then got out of the car and walked onto the property. Since we had also now driven on the tracks, we couldn't find where the footprints ended. The property was quite large, with tons of trees and bushes. We knew that the footprints could have gone anywhere. We decided to call the police, as the whole situation was too weird. We figured it was better safe than sorry. We would just have the officer go up to the property with us and check everything out. We drove down the road till we got service, called the police, and waited for their arrival. When the policeman showed up, we led him to the footprints. He scanned the property, and even partly in the surrounding woods, but determined there was no one out there, or anywhere near. Obviously, we were a little shaken up, but thanked the officer as he left. Needless to say, neither of us were in the mood to sit in the hot tub in the dark woods after the whole situation. Instead, we locked the doors and watched a movie I had downloaded on my laptop in one of the bedrooms. Though, we were both tired from the whole day and had passed out not too far into the movie. Fast forward to 3 a.m., and I woke up. I remember seeing my laptop had finished the movie with my girlfriend fast asleep right next to me. I shut off the laptop and set it on the nightstand, though I was pretty confused as to what woke me up, as I'm a pretty deep sleeper and won't wake up to almost anything. That's when I heard a slight bump on the bedroom window. The curtains were closed, so I couldn't see what produced the sound. I figured it must have been a small clump of snow falling on the window, and proceeded to lay back down to fall back asleep. But not even 10 seconds later, the sound came again. This time a little louder. At that point, I thought it best to get out of bed, pull back the curtains, and see what was making the noise. And so I did. I got up and opened the curtains, but there was nothing. I turned on my flashlight on my phone to get a better look, as honestly all I could see was darkness. I had to open the window so the light wouldn't glare, and right as I did, my light revealed fresh footprints in the snow right under the window. I was instantly put on edge. I proceeded to point my flashlight into the darkness, and I swear I could see a figure just standing there in the snow maybe 10 yards out. The footprints under the window led exactly to where the figure was standing. My heart dropped, but I stayed calm. I closed the window and woke up my girlfriend, telling her we had to go. She asked me why, but I didn't tell her, knowing she would freak out. I just said we needed to pack our stuff and leave immediately. Confused, she complied. About 10 minutes after I had seen the man out the window, we both had all of our stuff at the front door and were ready to make a dash for it to the car. And so we did. I opened the door and we dashed outside to the driveway with all of our stuff and got inside. I started the car and was starting to reverse out of the driveway when my girlfriend screamed. I looked to where she was looking in reaction, and there the figure was, right beside the house, now just watching us leave. I booked it out of there, not looking back. Once we got far enough to have cell service, we sent over a text to the Airbnb's host explaining the whole situation. And later that morning, we would get a text back from the guy. He said that he went to the cabin, and there were indeed footprints all around the building. He said the footprints stopped at every window. This freaked us both out, but realistically it was out of our hands now. We never heard back from the guy, so we never ended up knowing if anything ever came of the whole situation. But that figure, and just the whole experience in general, still terrifies me and my girlfriend to this day. I'm 18, and I just recently moved out of my parents' house to go to an out-of-state college in California. Now, my flight flew in a few days before the school dorms actually opened, so me and a few friends thought it would be fun to rent an Airbnb until then. So we did just that. We bought the cheapest one we could find, as we were just broke college kids. On the first day when we arrived, I couldn't help but notice how sketchy the area was. You could easily tell we weren't in the best part of town, but I guess that's what we get for buying the cheapest option. It was the second night, and all my friends went to a nearby house party, though I decided not to go, as I had a pretty bad headache and didn't feel like doing much. So I was left home alone. It was around 9 p.m., and I was just coming out of the bathroom when I heard the front gate to the yard swing open. I saw someone run past the porch window and into the backyard. From what I could see, it looked like a deranged guy hunched over wearing all black. In reaction, I ran to the window facing the backyard, but I didn't see anyone. Though I never saw the guy return, which meant he must have been somewhere in my backyard. I stood there looking out the backyard window for a good few seconds when I heard a knock on the front door. I jumped in reaction, but walked over to see a pretty normal-looking dude in his 40s. I went right up to the security bars, and the guy proceeded to ask me if I'd seen his son. I replied saying, "Yeah, I think so. I just saw someone go into the backyard." He responded saying his son ran away, and he'd been following him trying to catch up to him. It struck me as weird though, as the first guy didn't look much younger than the second. I thought there was no chance he was this guy's son. The guy walked off towards the backyard before I could question it though. I waited by the front door for a bit, until I saw both of the guys fidgeting with the door in the back. I went up to ask what they were doing, and they stopped for a second, and just replied with, "Hey man, my son really has to use the bathroom. Could you unlock this door and let us in?" The guy stood there staring at me, dead in the eyes, waiting for my response. I told them no, as these guys really gave me an off vibe. And that's when the second guy threw his whole body at the front door in an attempt to break it down. I jumped back in response, and ran upstairs to grab my phone to call the police. I stayed up there till they arrived, though the two men were gone when the police arrived. The two officers proceeded to tell me that 2 other break-ins were reported in that area not even an hour ago. I never knew if they ended up catching the 2 guys. It's likely that the first guy ran into the backyard to try to find a way in the house, and the second guy went to help him. What disturbs me most is the fact that they didn't want to break in just to rob the place. They weren't even scared off by the fact that someone was home. They clearly wanted me to open the door so that they could get inside and do who knows what.
I'm a male living in South Korea. My cousin, Nari, used to be an Airbnb hostess here in Seoul. The site's become massive. There's something like 2 million properties listed on it, so no matter where you're traveling to in the world, chances are that there's somebody with a room or a condo or even an entire house to rent. During her time hosting, Nari met a whole bunch of colourful characters. There were the sweet older couple that came to stay with her 8 times while visiting friends in the city. There was the guy who insisted on bringing his dog with him, this little rat-sized chihuahua that was about half the size of my cat's. There were a few people who were high maintenance, and there were a few who were really chilled, and ended up joining us for drinks at the bar down the street. I never hosted personally, but I'd help Nari out with her bookings if she had to work late and needed someone to meet her guests. Well, for all the good people, there was Mr. Park. He was this creepy, balding guy that stayed with Nari for a week while he was in town on business. At least, he said that was his reason anyway. I think we were both relieved when he left. I'd met him once, and didn't like the vibe I got off the guy, and there wasn't much she could do to kick him out early or anything, lest he gave her a bad review and dropped her score on the site. After he left, Nari discovered a weird plastic thing he had left in the shower. Turns out, he had left his slimy, fake vagina masturbation aid sitting next to her soap. I took one look and had to explain to her what it was. I remember her picking it up in a plastic bag, like the way people scoop up dog shit on the street. From then on, Nari was pretty picky when it came to who she let stay. One weekend, Nari had to leave for a business trip, so she left me the spare key. She had a booking coming up, a young woman named Sumi, and I was to play host. We'll just call her Sue from here. Sue checked in, got the key from me, and put her suitcase in the spare room. I didn't see any more of her that Friday, or for the rest of the weekend, and I figured she was out enjoying herself. Not too long after that, I could have sworn I saw Mr. Park in our local grocery store. Same balding head, same vibe, but he was at one end of the aisle and I the other. I got that feeling like I was being watched, but when I looked directly, he was gone. At the time, I shrugged it off, figured it had to be some other balding guy, and I was just projecting my anxiety. Now, the building I live in is fairly old, which means that the walls are pretty thick, and noise tends to only travel in the hallway. If I'm waiting for the elevator, I can occasionally hear someone's TV if it's really loud, but that's about it. That Monday morning, I was woken up far too early by a pounding sound. It was maybe 6 or 6:30 in the morning, and the sun was barely up. At that point, I was pissed. I threw on a housecoat and yanked open the front door without bothering to look in the peephole. I was greeted by 2 very tense policemen. They asked for my name, and if I knew the young woman who lived across the hall from me, pointing to Nari's apartment. Without thinking, I ran across the hall and through the open door, just knowing in my gut that Nari was supposed to be returning that morning, and that something must be wrong if there were police at my door. The cops yelled for me to wait, but I was on autopilot. At first, I thought someone had robbed the place. Her TV was smashed, her couch was ripped apart like it had been mauled by a bear, her photos were buried under broken glass, her laptop had practically melted into the floor. And then I realized, in some part of my brain, that her TV and laptop wouldn't be here if it was a simple robbery. And that's when I smelled it. Death has a certain stench to it. Sometimes, if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, like a hospital corridor, you'll get a whiff of it. What I smelled was a full-on, closed-handed fist slug into the face. In a panic, I couldn't stop myself. I flung open the first bedroom door. Nari's room looked just like the living room, but she wasn't in it. By this time, the officers had caught up with me and were trying to steer me back out of the unit, but I broke free of their grasp and flung open the spare bedroom door. Inside was what was left of Sue. We get so desensitized to violence on TV that when we're actually confronted with it in real life, it seems almost absurd, like it's totally unreal. She had literally been torn to shreds with a knife. Just from smelling the air alone, I could taste that metallic flavor of blood in the back of my mouth. I showered several times a day for the next week and could not get that taste, that smell out of my hair or skin. It turns out that Sue had been there since Friday night. Nari got home a few hours later. By that time, the forensics team had already been in and out and were starting to clean up the scene. I couldn't tell her about what I'd seen. I just remember hugging her. While investigating, the police had found a second set of keys. This meant there was actually a third set of keys to Nari's place, and those keys had prints. 3 guesses as to who they traced back to. Mr. Park. Park had made a set of keys while staying at Nari's, and he wasn't here on business as he had claimed. It turns out he lived about 15 minutes outside of the city. Security camera footage showed him coming into the building that Friday night, and him lurking around outside for the past month prior to that, just after his stay. Surprisingly, Park confessed to the murder, said he didn't know that Nari would be out of town, that he hadn't known she had had a guest that weekend. His wife had recently left him and taken the kids with her, and Nari reminded him of a younger version of his wife. Nari and I have both moved buildings since then. I still can't believe that all of this came because of broken trust. By giving a stranger a safe place to stay, by letting him into her home, this person was so twisted that he thought to make a copy of her key. If it had been any other weekend, Nari would have been at home, and what happened to Sue would have happened to her too.
Number 1. Across the Bane. Submitted by Caleb Sharp. Not too long ago did I work at Subway, my first paying job that I would grow to hate. I needed the money though, and the thought of facing customers finally broke me out of my shell. I guess in a way it did. I got the job around late April of 2016. My brother-in-law and sister had been wanting me to get a job so I could break out of my depression and hopefully alleviate some stress. At that time, my grandmother had a vicious stroke, and it was up to me to take care of her. I ended up having to drop out of school, and it made me very homebound, as she could not be by herself too long. At first, I loved it. Everyone was very nice and kind, from customers to the employees. The minimum wage thing didn't bother me too much, as I was happy to be making money for myself for once. All was happy and good, until November that year. Around then I knew what I was doing. The sandwiches, the prepping. I didn't have a problem with that anymore. I'd even made some friends and I couldn't complain with my job. But every now and then I would have this regular, not surprising as I live in a small college town in the South. He was an athletic man, a toned one, but he had a strong lisp and would often converse with the men on our staff such as I. Personally, I didn't mind him at first. His jokes were okay, I'd guess. But it would seem that he had a deeper reason for making them. Now, I'm pretty dense and have problems picking up on social cues, but after I made his salad and he had left, one of my coworkers pointed out that the guy had been trying to hit on me. I laughed it off, but it kinda dwelled on me, to be honest. Now, don't get me wrong, I didn't dwell on it because I have a problem with gays. I don't. In fact, one of my childhood mentors was obvious with it. He was a man I looked up to, and we shared the same humor. No, this guy, he was weird. As time would go on, I'd realize he was just hitting on me. And eventually, he would start calling the store and would usually request to talk to me. He would start asking me personal questions, like how my day was, if I had eaten yet. Then he would start asking about my dog. At that point, I was angry, because how in the world did this stranger know about my dog? When he said that, I kind of broke. I told him to F off, and I told my manager what was up. Luckily, she took my side. She eventually blacklisted his number and had a no-serve order on him. Only a few of the employees even knew about the guy, and they were college kids my age. Usually getting drunk or high and are pretty reclusive, these college kids had no clue, and to this whole situation, they were equally as freaked out as I was. Luckily, we didn't see or hear from this guy again. That is, until he really crossed the line. One night, I was on the closing shift. It had been about 3 months in the freezing season of February. This dude had stopped coming here since around January, and my grandma had passed away recently, so my mind was focused on other stresses. It was really late, and I had skipped my break during a rush and was told to enjoy a 30-minute one before we closed. Not one to argue about a break, I stepped out back for a cigarette with my phone in hand. I'd been reading something my friend wrote for a minute when someone suddenly taps on my shoulder. I hadn't seen anyone out there. I thought I was alone. So when I felt that tapping, I jumped back and nearly crapped myself in the process. And when I saw who it was, I was far from relieved. It's the same guy, standing there in some tracksuit. I called him out, telling him he's not supposed to be here. He laughed this condescending laugh for a second, then asked me about my nieces. Now I live with my brother and sister, and I'm a very active uncle in their lives. They often see me as their older brother at times. When he mentioned them, my blood began to boil. He then asked me simply to hand over my phone and wallet. I refused, and more so, I told him to remove himself from the premises before I did it for him. Just then, the guy reaches into his track pants and pulls out a freaking crowbar. What went through my mind at first was to allow him to get the first hit, so I could hopefully dodge it or grab the weapon. But all in all, I wish he just wasn't there. Before this guy could make another move, or attack me, whatever he was going to do, I noticed that my brother was sitting outside of his car. Now, my brother is no army guy or cop. He is a hard-working man and a determined hiker, and wherever he goes, he carries his 5.5-foot walking stick with him. He's kind of self-trained for self-defense. I mean, all you gotta do is whack him hard with the walking stick, right? Well, I stepped out slowly onto the parking lot with my hands up, and this guy was not far behind me. I looked towards my brother with an expression of distress, and that's when he noticed the guy. Getting out of his car, my brother grabs his stick, yelling while also beating it on the building wall, grabbing the man's attention. I honestly didn't know what he was going to do when he saw that. Would he realize that a crowbar might beat some walking stick and escalate things? Or would he simply give up? Well, when he saw my brother, he turned tail and ran away. And I let out a sigh of relief. Honestly, I didn't know what that guy was going to do. When we went back inside, I told my boss what happened, but she didn't seem to take it too seriously. Or so I thought. Because about a week later, some of our usual boys in blue came in. We put on our gloves to make them a sandwich, but they told us that they weren't there for the sandwiches. Just to pass on the info to our boss that they caught the trespasser with 20 pills of stolen Xanax. I caught on quickly and agreed to pass it on, knowing the guy they meant was the one that attempted to attack me. It's been 3 months, and I've quit for reasons that were unrelated, but after contemplating the situation, I realized that I usually stand at the edge of the outside wall behind the store, making it pretty easy for anyone to just stand behind the corner unseen and watch me as I'm oblivious taking my break. Number 2. Closing shift at Subway. Submitted by Donutio. I'm 20 years old and I live in Canada. This story took place during the 2016 clown craze in October, about 10 to 20 minutes before my Subway store was going to close. To make things a little easier to understand, I've got to give a brief explanation of the layout of our store. So there's the front door that customers walk through, which is completely made of glass. Then there's the windows to the left, if you're standing behind the counter facing the front. The bathroom is beside the swinging door that employees use to get to the sandwich unit. This all began while I was finishing doing dishes in the back room. I was the only person there because they rarely had more than one employee for the closing shift, unless of course it was for training purposes. Really, only one employee is needed, even though it might not be a smart decision. There hadn't been any customers for a while, and I really had to go to the bathroom, so I started making my way to the swinging door by the sandwich unit, when all of a sudden I heard the bell ding at the front door, indicating that a customer had entered. I was honestly a bit annoyed because I'd been putting off going to the bathroom for a long time, and obviously I can't leave someone unattended in the front store. Before I even turned around to take the person's order, and I know it's going to sound odd, but I heard the generic sound of a clown's nose honking. It sent shivers and goosebumps through my entire body. As I hesitantly turned around to confirm what I had just heard, there was someone standing at the door with a bright orange afro and white face paint. Beyond that, they were dressed extremely casually, though in a plain green zip-up hoodie and black jeans, which almost made it creepier. They stared at me and smiled from ear to ear. Before I could even think of doing anything, they gave me a sinister little wave before quickly running out of the store and around the left side window. I was frozen in place. I was wondering, was this really happening? Or better yet, why was this happening? I didn't know the clown craze reached my small town. I just stared at the window for what felt like 10 minutes. Once I came to, I ran to the front door and just locked it. There was no way I was letting anyone in, even if we weren't closed yet. But before I did, I poked my head around the corner to make sure that lunatic was gone for sure. Well, I didn't see anything. He was gone, I thought. I couldn't see him anywhere. The parking lot was empty save for my car. So I went back in the store and locked the doors, counting the seconds until the actual closing time was here. But not 10 minutes until closing. A couple of cops were knocking at the door. I was nervous, yet relieved to see them. I immediately unlocked the doors and let them inside. Apparently, they were there to just ask me a few questions. They wanted to know if I had seen someone dressed with an orange afro and white makeup. Yeah, I was excited to tell them that some creep was out there so that they could catch this guy. Well, they explained that someone called not too long ago, saying that they drove by and saw someone matching that description in the subway parking lot, kneeling behind a green sedan. They were holding a carving knife. My heart seemed to stop. That was my car. This psycho was waiting for me behind my car. If the cops hadn't scared him away by showing up, he'd still be out there. What would have happened if I walked out there alone at closing time? I was scared more than I'd ever been, but the cops offered to walk me to my car and even check it if I needed them to. I happily obliged. Then I got out of there and stayed the night with a family member nearby, because after that horrific experience, I couldn't be alone. The clown craze was always hilarious in my eyes until something actually happened to me. There was just something horrifying about the contrast of the clown hair and makeup, along with normal everyday clothing. Better yet, what would have happened if I was already in the bathroom, defenseless and unaware? I'm so thankful I held it for as long as I did, and that some stranger drove by and saw this weirdo. I'm happy that I didn't find out what this lunatic was capable of. You can bet I don't work the closing shift at Subway anymore. Number 3. Subway Spooks. Submitted by Michael T. Back when I was just out of college, me and a friend of mine, let's call him James, decided to eat at a Subway. After all, it wasn't far from James' little apartment he lived at. When we arrived, I could already feel this weird vibe of the place. This was a little normal, since James lives in a poor, run-down part of the city, so I normally felt like this when I drived around this area. Well, we went inside the Subway and it was pretty normal. I ended up getting a tuna and James got a steak and cheese. And all of a sudden, this guy walks in. He was really pale and skinny and was wearing a dirty wife beater with ripped track pants. He was balding and looked to be around 40 or 50 years old. He came up to the man working behind the counter, then just stood there staring right at him, doing literally nothing, just staring. Me and James were a little freaked out about this, and we felt a little bad for the guy working behind the counter, but we tried to ignore him while we ate our sandwiches. It was none of our businesses at the time. Around 1 minute later, the men working the counter decided to try and get the man out, since the guy was obviously not there for an order. Besides, the place didn't have much of security, no guards or cameras, so someone this sketchy could have been a liability. The guy came around the side when the creepy man suddenly ran out of the store. I mean, he bolted. But as he ran out, he passed us, and he locked eyes with me. It gave me a very nervous feeling. I just wanted to blend in with the background and enjoy my sandwich. But there this weird guy was, making a scene and looking right at me as he ran past and exited the store. He managed to get out of the store without a hassle. Though he looked at me as he exited, he never even looked in front of him, yet he didn't trip or run into anything. This guy was some kind of freak. 5 minutes later, we heard a car alarm go off really nearby, and maybe 10 seconds later, I realized what was happening. I saw lights coming from the window exactly where I parked my car. It wasn't that great of a car, but it's all I could afford at the time. So I ran out of the store along with James, and we were honestly about to beat the crap out of the person who was trying to break in our car. But when we got outside, nobody was there at my car. So we decided to call it a night before anything else crazy happened. We hopped in my car, not even finishing our food. We didn't even want to at that point, and we were about to drive off. But the moment the car started and the headlights turned on, we saw him. The creepy guy from the Subway was in front of our car now. I had no idea where he'd been hiding before, but I swear to God we didn't see him. He was about to jump on the hood of my car. He must have been some junkie or something, since he didn't jump until we backed out. We sped off on the way to James's place until he said he didn't want to go home. He lived too close to the Subway, and the last thing he wanted was that guy to see where he lives. I couldn't say I blamed James. I think I would have done the same thing, but it was weird coming from James because he was the bravest person I knew. So I told him that he could stay at my place, then we went home. Honestly, that was the last I saw of this creepy Subway guy. I don't know what was wrong with him, and I've never seen him again. But probably because of him, I'll never be going back to Subway. At least, not that one. One scary day, my mom and I went to Subway for a quick snack. When we reached our destination, we got out of the car and went inside. Inside, I sat at a table near the only window there. I'd always liked the window seats. My mom was ordering, and I was just watching like the little stalker I was. But as I watched my mother deal with the cashier, the situation seemed to get weird. I could hear them talking from where I was, when I suddenly heard the words sex and children. I was starting to get nervous, so I went up to the counter and rested my arm on my mom's head. I'm a lot taller than my mom. The cashier looks at me with an angered look and says, "Who the F are you?" I hadn't even said or done anything, and he's treating me like that. I'd gone to anger classes before, and I did pretty well. But even still, it took everything I had just to say, "I'm her son. Why?" I wanted to say so much more to someone that rude. The cashier was wide-eyed. "He's your son?" My mother said yes. Then the cashier pretended that nothing happened, even though I wanted to snap his freaking neck. My mom saw my anger and said to calm down. I just didn't know why this guy was being so disrespectful. The cashier is staring at something under the table, and I look suspiciously at him and look over the table. The cashier noticed me looking at him, so he lifted his head up fast, like he was looking at something in secret. I was still trying very much to fight the anger from this rude person. I don't know what he and my mom had been talking about, but he still had no reason to treat us like he did. Suddenly, and I still have no idea what set this guy off, maybe he was crazy, he pulls out a pistol that he had apparently taped under the counter, and he began to point it at the two of us. And when he did, I let anger take over me, and I jumped over the counter and began fighting with this guy. I felt like if I didn't, someone was going to get hurt, and I wasn't going to give up until that gun was out of his hand. Taking quick glances to check on my mother, she seemed extremely surprised, and she was still like a statue. As I'm struggling with the cashier, he whips the arm holding the gun toward my head, and I flinch and feel something smash into me. It hurts, but I don't stop fighting with this man. My mom at this point was running out of the store, and before I knew it, I feel another crushing thud against the back of my head, and then everything slowly got dark. I came to in a hospital bed. Confused, I got up, but at that moment, the only thing I felt was pain. I dropped myself back onto the bed. A doctor walked in and said that I had a concussion. He told me not to worry, that I'd be fine within about a month. All I have to say is that I'm glad I didn't get shot. We are, along with several others, pressing charges against this freak. Apparently, the guy just snapped, and no one knew he had been hiding a weapon in the store. Number 5. Subway Watcher. Submitted by Orion. I'm here to share with you a really strange story. This is not my own experience, it's my friend's story. And let's call him James. James has been working at a Subway for a year, and he really hates his job, but it pays pretty good. Well, on February 11th of 2016, he almost quit, because he was just having a regular day until this one customer comes in. It's a big guy, very rough looking. He welcomes the guy, saying that he'd be with him in a moment because he had to finish up another order. Eventually, they get to his order, and James rings him up at the register. Once everything is done, he hands the guy his sandwich bag. But the guy doesn't move. He doesn't try to take the sandwich. He tries to get the man's attention. Maybe he just zoned out for a second. But the guy completely stops. He doesn't blink. He's just staring straight ahead into nothingness. James was wondering what happened, because it looked like the guy glitched, as if he was an android that stopped working. James even clapped his hands in front of the man to see if he would blink, but he didn't. He didn't react to anything. Freaking out, James runs to his manager to see what needed to be done. Maybe this guy had a health condition. Maybe they needed to call an ambulance. For all James knew, he was having a strange seizure or something. But as he and the manager approach the front of the store, the man isn't there, and the sandwich bag is still on the counter. The manager is annoyed, thinking that James made this up to freak him out. But James is serious, so he talks the manager into showing him the tapes to prove his point about how weird this guy was. They go together since the store was closed to check the security footage. And get this, the guy never shows up on the tapes. James was dumbfounded when he saw it, because there was James making the sandwich for no one. Now, my friend may be a stoner every other weekend when he can, but he's definitely never been known to hallucinate. He still doesn't know what happened that day.
In January of 1992, Kelly Day Wilson was just a 17-year-old senior at Gilmer High School. With her well-coiffed curly blonde hair and extravagant jewelry choices and bright blue eyes, Kelly Day was a pretty picture and had no problem making friends after she relocated from Natchitoches, Louisiana to Gilmer, Texas so she could live with her mother and stepfather. She hit the ground running and struck up an on-again, off-again relationship with a young man by the name of Chris Denton, and the two spent a great deal of time together in the lead-up to the new year. It seems Kelly's life was going swimmingly well, and it's clear that no one could have possibly expected what fate had in store for her, something that would raise questions among true crime enthusiasts that pervade even today. On January 5th, 1992, Kelly finished her shift at the Gilmer Square outlet of Northeast Texas Video, closing the store at around 8:30 p.m. before heading over to a local bank to deposit the store's daily takings. This particular bank branch's security cameras showed that an individual did indeed make the night deposit for that evening, but the captured footage didn't provide a clear enough image of the person for a positive identification of Kelly, simply showing an arm in her car. We can presume it was her, but we can't be 100% certain. After locking down the store's shutters with their manager, Joe, he wished Kelly good night before driving away in his truck. The last he ever saw of her, she was last seen wearing cut-off stonewashed jeans, a purple rugby shirt with gold trim, and brown loafers, and was getting into her car in preparation for her night drive to the bank. But Kelly didn't arrive home that night, nor did she check in with any of her friends. Her mother became so worried that she sent her stepfather out into the night to aid in the police search that ensued. And like grim Providence, it was him that found Kelly's abandoned car in the Northeast Texas Video parking lot at around 5 a.m. The car was sporting a single slashed tire, and all of Kelly's personal belongings, including her purse, were inside of her car. Only she and her keys were missing. At first glance, what happened appeared to be a complete mystery, but it was one that local law enforcement was determined to get to the bottom of. For 2 years, the investigation into Kelly's disappearance was headed up by a Sergeant James Brown. One of the first people investigated was obviously Joe, her manager, and the last person to see her alive. However, not only did Joe have multiple alibis, he passed several lie detector tests issued by the police, and as a result, he was rolled out as a suspect. Sergeant Brown oversaw a team consisting of hundreds of police officers and local volunteers, one of which poured thousands of man-hours into an intensive search of the surrounding area. Yet despite such a thorough search, as well as hundreds of tips from the general public, not a single trace of Kelly was ever found. Police believed that they were close when they arrested 17-year-old Michael Bibby, who was taken into custody on misdemeanor charges in an incident of alleged tire slashing. Michael was guilty of many, many things, but as police discovered, slashing Kelly's tires wasn't one of them, and in the end, he too was ruled as a suspect in Kelly's disappearance. Investigators then turned their gaze to another suspect, Kelly's on and off again boyfriend, Chris Denton. The couple were said to have been going through a rough patch at the time of her disappearance, and with people saying that Chris had something of a short temper, there was a period where he became the case's prime suspect. However, through the course of the investigation, circumstantial evidence would clear him of all wrongdoing, and the police would be forced to look elsewhere for their abductor. Unbelievably, in a number of interviews conducted in the process of their investigation, police had heard a handful of stories alluding to a satanic cult that called Gilmer home. But since the accusations named members of law enforcement as members of the cult, specifically Sergeant James Brown himself, the claims weren't taken seriously by those that heard them. Yet, in 1994, the local community was rocked by almost 50 indictments against 10 different people, all on charges of child abuse. And given some of the evidence presented against them, police proceeded with charges of aggravated assault, aggravated kidnapping, and capital murder in connection with Kelly Day Wilson's disappearance. It's at this point that Kelly's story seems to intersect with that of the Kerr family, because in 1990, a man named Wendell Kerr told his wife, Loretta, that he wanted a divorce, kicking off a chain of events that would bring prosecutors their one best chance at finding the perpetrator. Wendell Kerr was one of 6 adult children of Eugene and Geneva Kerr, a couple who were briefly married in the 1950s before a hastily divorce. Geneva Kerr went on to marry 2 other men, both of whom died before Geneva remarried Eugene, making him both her first and her 4th husband. According to their children, Eugene and Geneva Kerr abused their children on a daily basis. A relative later confirmed their claims of carnal abuse and spoke of witnessing daily incidents of indecent assault. This same relative also confirmed that they'd witnessed Geneva Kerr's interest in satanic practices, including daily readings from the Satanic Bible and an interest in both animal and human sacrifices. In exchange for law enforcement's help escaping the Kerr family, one of their grown-up son's wives offered to tell investigators everything. She claimed she was kept as a slave to the family for 10 years, couldn't drive a car, constantly threatened by Geneva and Danny, and her only form of identification, her birth certificate, was kept by Danny in his wallet. In her own horrifying words, her role was simply as a breeder. Cut back to Wendell asking his wife for a divorce. Loretta strongly began to suspect that Wendell was trying to ditch her for a younger woman, and if that was the case, she was going to burn his entire life down before she left. She went to the police with accusations, and as a result, Wendell was arrested, placed on the offenders register, and forced to serve out a period of probation. A state welfare worker assigned to the case later concluded that ritualistic, satanic abuse was endemic in all branches of the Kerr family, and over the next several years, almost a dozen of the clan's children were taken into the care of Child Protective Services. The social worker also mentioned in a horrifying affidavit that in October of 1992, 2 of the children took us to show us where the devil meet people to abuse and hurt babies. In 1994, the escaped Kerr wife was interviewed by the Harrison County Jail in Marshall, Texas, in which she described in gruesome detail the torture that Kelly Wilson would receive for approximately 9 days before she was ritually sacrificed and then cannibalized. She described Geneva as the leader and said that several of the Kerr clan, along with Sergeant James Brown, were all present during these events. Connie Martin and Wanda Kerr both had stated in interviews that Kelly Wilson was a birthday present for Geneva Kerr, and that the matriarch reveled in the poor girl's torment. Yet, in light of the accusations, it came to light that information was allegedly coerced from the Kerr children, as well as some of those indicted in the disappearance. Some of the children were allegedly programmed to tell the stories the investigators wanted, while the prosecution tried to coerce a confession by offering life in prison in opposition to the death penalty as long as they confessed to the killing, best summarized in a quote from a state official that reads, "Investigators working on little more than hearsay have created a mythology about a satanic cult, leading to what some describe as a modern witch hunt. They indicted a whole family and even a police investigator, destroying his law enforcement career, straining his marriage and prompting death threats. The Texas Attorney General, finding no evidence any of the charges were true, instead uncovered suggestions that the whole cult theory was the product of coercion by overzealous investigators, even to the point that they physically restrained children to elicit allegations of satanic activity. Ultimately, the Attorney General's office were forced to dismiss every single one of the charges alleging satanic abuse and sacrificial murder. The satanic cult was found to be a complete fabrication, nothing more than a fantasy concocted by the Kerr children under the influence of police investigators. Chris Denton, Kelly's old boyfriend, tragically died of cancer in 2004, but there were rumors that he had made a deathbed confession. But close family dismissed these allegations as thoughtless, malicious hearsay and maintain Chris's innocence to this day. Joe Henry, the owner and manager of the Northeast Texas Video and the last person to see Kelly before she vanished, stayed mostly under the radar for a number of years. But in a despicable twist in the story, Joe was arrested on charges of possessing indecent images of children. However, police have emphasized that in spite of the nature of the charges against him, he had never been considered a serious suspect in Kelly's case. For all the twists and turns, trials and confessions, finger-pointing, and numerous suspects, Kelly Wilson has never been found, despite 20 years of searching. She is presumed dead, but a body has never been found and no valid charges have ever been made in connection with the case. Without a body or Audrey's Jeep being recovered, there's simply no way of coming up with any definitive explanation as to why she disappeared. There must be a rational explanation as to why she vanished, but given the circumstances, for all intents and purposes, Audrey and her vehicle basically dropped off the face of the earth, never to be seen again.